Okay, welcome to the third session of Project 2025 Study Group. My name is Jim Dingman, and we have been looking at various aspects of Project 2025. That, of course, is the policy compilation that was sponsored by the Heritage Foundation and, of course, included former members of the Trump administration and others to talk about what kind of policy prescriptions they will implement in a new Trump administration. Now, just to give a brief political update, we can see in recent days the Trump administration has been essentially distancing itself, or excuse me, Freudian slip. The Trump campaign has been distancing itself from Project 2025 because they are well aware of the polling data that's been taken since June that shows the more you know about Project 2025, the less you like it. And this even includes polling data with Republican voters and independent voters. So Trump on July 30th, his campaign made a distinct comment saying, please do not associate us. If you do, you will have consequences, etc. However, they're still, of course, following all this, and they still have that big employment pool that they're building up. I think it's up to 20,000 people now, because one of the objectives of this whole effort is to basically have in place, vetted prior to the election, a pool of people that they can put into office and create the infrastructure that they desire. Now, today we're going to talk about two aspects of Project 2025. We're going to talk about the Department of State, and we're also going to talk about the intelligence community. He deals with, they have all sorts of different policy prescriptions they talk about with the Department of State and the intelligence community in general. If we have time, we're going to get into Agenda 47, which is the actual document on the Trump website for president that talks about what they want. And others are saying that basically the distance is that Trump wants to make sure that he controls. It's how he controls what the agenda is. He doesn't want to delegate it right now to those who are taking away his political support. And the key thing is the polling data. At some point, I'll throw up the polling data, which vividly illustrates what I'm talking about. Now, here you have the beginning of the section that deals with Department of State. And some of this, again, is boilerplate. You know, the Department of State has been the American government's designated tool of engagement with foreign governments and peoples throughout the world. At the same time, however, in all administrations, there is a tug of war between presidents and bureaucracies, and that resistance is much starker under conservative presidents, due largely to the fact that large swaths of the State Department's workforce are left-wing and predisposed to disagree with the conservative president's policy, agenda, and vision. It should not and cannot be this way. The American people need and deserve a diplomatic machine fully focused on the national interest as defined through the election of a president who sets the domestic and international agenda for the nation. So there you get into this whole question of how they want to repair and essentially make the civil service completely up to a political perspective that is in line with the Trump administration if it comes into power. Now, they talk about the question of the State Department. We can, this is something we can debate. The State Department is, in terms of actual power in the literature for the past 50 years, is certainly looked on as less important politically than the way the Department of Defense has created combined, united theaters of operation in different parts of the world. They tend to have more resources. Even the former commander of Central Command, General Zinni, who was a Marine Corps officer, he in fact wrote a book condemning the fact that the unified theater command structure had usurped the strength of the State Department. And I heard him talk about that once at the Council of Foreign Relations at a book event they had there. They used to let the press in. They still do to some of these events at the Council of Foreign Relations. But they're talking here about the State Department and the different functions of the State Department. Now, again, we're talking we're not talking, we can get into radical perspectives later, but we're talking here about the functions of the government as they currently run. So the State Department provides humanitarian security and other assistance to non-U.S. populations around the world. And properly led, the State Department can be an instrument for communicating and implementing a foreign policy vision that best serves American citizens. Now, then they bring up some of the critiques of the State Department. This was done during the Hart-Rudman. This is Senator Hart. This is 20 years ago. They basically were criticizing the State Department in terms of it becoming a weaker institution. This is again, Zinni is just simply reflecting these kind of arguments about the State Department. Here, of course, they're talking about the fact that the State Department, now they say that its failures are not due to lack of resources. That I would disagree with. I do think that anyone I know many people who served in the State Department, or people who've been involved in serving in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and always the Department of State was sort of integrated with the Department of Defense, but the State Department was, and sometimes if you go back to the intelligence apparatus of the State Department back in times of the Vietnam War, they were actually much better at predicting the political military events of the Vietnam War, but that has diminished in this present situation. So the State Department, I believe, has indeed been is a weaker institution than it was. But let's get further into what they're talking about. So here they're talking about the next president will require that the president's handpicked political leadership needs to run the department. So here we get into this question of how they're going to actually do this. Now, exert leverage during the confirmation process. They want to make sure that the president can exert leverage on the Senate if he or she is willing to place State Department appointees directly into these roles. Now, remember, many ways that both the Democrats and Republicans, they get around the confirmation process is they simply appoint temporary people who basically then become heads of departments for months and often years, because they avoid the confirmation process in the Senate. They want to assert leadership in the appointment process. In other words, in the next administration, they're assuming that they're going to take control of the House and the Senate. So they want to make sure that they can control appointees that come into positions. And keep in mind this, by placing political appointees in positions that do not require Senate confirmation, they gain political control. They want to support and train political appointees. So here, the Secretary of State should use his office and resources to assure regular coordination among all political appointees. And so they want to, of course, have a whole set of political appointees that they can, quote, depopulate, as they argue, the deep state. Remember, they always make these comments. The deep state, who's the deep state? The deep state are permanent civil service employees of the State Department who they want to essentially denude and defang and essentially attrit tremendously as rapidly as they can. Now here, of course, they give lip service to the value of career officials, because you have career officials in the State Department, multilingual skills, etc. So they do give some kudos to keeping these guys in here. They want to make sure that these guys, of course, are there as apparatchiks. They want to reboot ambassadors worldwide. They want every ambassador to resign immediately throughout the world. And here they're talking about how they not only want political ambassadors to resign, they want career ambassadors to resign. In other words, a civil servant in the State Department who has, risen to a G10, G11 level of sort of the equivalent of a brigadier general, major general in the armed forces, and they want those guys all out on day one, so they can put their political appointees in power immediately. They want to review every aspect of the funding and negotiations of the State Department. They want to implement repair. The State Department must change its handling of international agreements to restore constitutional governance. Now, that, of course, is another controversial aspect of this, because what is constitutional governance? What treaties do they look on as against constitutional governance? The international global climate change treaties are examples of that. They view that as unconstitutional. Hence, they want to rectify that. Here you get into the question of the calibration of State Department policy with other bureaucracies in the government. So, for example, they want to make sure that the Office of the Attorney General and the White House Counsel's Office, we already talked about this to some extent in the previous sessions, they want them all coordinating together so they can withdraw from treaties that they feel are not worthy of continuing.
Tim,
Under
there's
circum,
a important
yeah, go on,
line
Alex.
you're not
What?
emphasizing, which is that they want to not not enforce any treaties that are not have not been approved by the Senate. Again, these agreements they call them that are kind of just um, enforced, but again we're not. So anything not signed by the Senate, not agreed to by the Senate, they're like, well, that's we should ignore all that, which again is a lot as well. So,
Right, exactly. There's a lot of treaties that might not have gone through the Senate that are bilateral treaties between the United States and other countries, or even multilateral treaties get ignored in that. They want to coordinate with other agencies. Now, here's where you get into this whole question of ideological conformity. Because what they're talking about, I mean, they are talking about like I understand that there's a new book that is coming out by the guy who is in charge of Heritage, and Vance wrote his introduction to it, and it basically talks about the need for a second American Revolution. They're talking about a revolution. They have a counter-revolutionary attitude towards this, but they are indeed talking about a revolution in terms of governance structures in the United States. They want to coordinate with Congress. Now, here where you get into the question of, are they going to be able to sweep the Senate and the House, which is what they're aiming to do. And if Trump gets elected to the White House, I have a feeling that he will carry the House and the Senate. Remember, look at how close the margins are right now. I think the Democrats control the Senate by one or two votes, and the House is a very slim margin. There's maybe 10 seats in contests. People can correct me on this, but nevertheless, it's a very slim margin. They want to be able to carry that. And of course, when they look at the polling data that existed before Biden withdrew from the race, they clearly were in the uptake to be able to do that. I think they were predicting over 300 electoral votes if the polling data under Biden had continued. So now, of course, you have a different situation with Harris in the race. Now they can't, again, this question of China all the time. And I probably want to do a separate session on China, just with people who know about China. But they want to open a Office of China Coordination, which already exists, but they want this to be essentially ideologically in conformity with what they want to do. They say, for example, the concept is one, a Republican administration should support mutatis mutandis, and they're quoting Latin. The Chinese Communist Party has been at war with the U.S. for decades. Now this reality has been accepted. We have to be prepared to lead the U.S. diplomatic effort accordingly. They want to, here we get into this issue of migration issues. As we've talked about in the previous two sessions, they want to harmonize and turn the whole federal bureaucracy at all levels to their plans of mass deportation. So here you have reviewing immigration and domestic security requirements. They want to basically have, here we have the question of visa reciprocity. The United States should strictly enforce the doctrine of reciprocity when issuing visas to all foreign nationals. For too long, the U.S. has provided unfettered access to foreign nationals and countries that do not respond in kind. Then they have this question of Section 243D visa sanctions. Visa sanctions under Section 243D of the INA Act are enacted into law to motivate countries to accept the return of any nationals who've been ordered removed from the United States. They should be quickly and fully enforced. So they want to basically, this is part of their whole idea of mass deportation. They want to right-size admissions of refugees. And here you get into how they're constantly scoring high points in the public by harping continually on the situation on the border, which we know is induced by many factors that are not just simply, what are you going to do with economic and social inequalities in these societies that generate large amounts of migrants? What are you going to do with global climate change that collapses their economies, particularly in Central America and elsewhere around the world? This is just going to simply escalate, but their solution is essentially to create a fortress United States. Then you have bilateral, multilateral immigration-focused agreements. They want an evaluation of national security, vulnerable visa programs, all along the line of what they're doing. And of course, when we look at the data that talks about the role of immigrants in our society, they actually increase the economic strength of the United States. So it's a very interesting aspect of seeing in sort of couched words, essentially xenophobic policies being implemented for real. Now, the question of pivoting abroad, and I just want to ID what we're doing here. My name is Jim Dingman. This is the Project 2025 study group. We're talking about the Department of State and the intelligence community today. And I'm joined with a bunch of folks, and we're going to bring in their comments in a moment. I just want to go through the different policy areas they talk about. Now, of course, they emphasize China. The designs of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party are serious and dangerous. And they go into all these questions that, again, we go back to the 1970-72 pivot to China that occurred under the Nixon administration and ping-pong diplomacy on that. Now we're a long way from that with what we're talking about now. It's my personal feeling that, we have to have, in terms of the overall benefit to humanity, a peaceful and reasonable relationship with China, not one of hostility. And that goes both ways, by the way. But in any event, here you have this policy initiative where they want to create and divert all our resources and defense spending, et cetera, to contain China's aggression. And they view this as you need sustained near unprecedented U.S. growth. So this gets into their economic measures that they talk about. American energy independence, let the whole issue of the natural gas fracking, let frack to the max extent, and other issues here. And the U.S. Government needs an Article 10 for X for China. He's referring, of course, to George Kennan's famous essay on containment, signed by X, which was published in Foreign Affairs after World War II. And it was considered the intellectual framework for the containment policy against the Soviet Union. And they're referring here to how many people are in the national bureaucracy are reluctant to take decisive action against China. They're vested in an unshakable faith in the international system and global norms. They're so enamored they cannot brook any criticisms of reforms, let alone acknowledge their potential of being abused by China. But here they're just going into this whole question of we have to have this challenge against China. The PRC challenge is rooted in China's strategic culture and not just the Marxism-Leninism of the Chinese Communist Party, meaning that internal culture and civil society will never deliver a more normative action. Now, then we turn to Iran. Now, I was having a debate today. As people know, the Iranian government has announced that they are close to a breakout with nuclear weapons. That was estimated not only by the Iranian comments in May of this year. Politicians in Iran announced that they're close to deploying nuclear weapons. Intelligence estimates by the Western powers that were initially in the JCPOA framework, which was essentially designed to implement some sort of arms control with the development nuclear capability of the Iranians, they now have said that the Iranians are close to, within 6 months to have a nuclear weapon, even sooner. So, given what just happened in the past week with the assassination inside Tehran of Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas, and then you have also the attack in Beirut, Hezbollah leader killed, etc. And we now have I think we're sending aircraft carriers once again into the Mediterranean to, quote, deter or be there to operate in conjunction with the Israeli Air Force and air defense systems if indeed there's a repeat of an attack on Israel the same way they did a few months ago. We're in a situation where you can, I don't have to tell you, was also being exposed to people talk about the possibility of a regional war, etc. Um, the Obama and Biden administrations have propped up the Islamic theocracy. So this is sort of boilerplate. The Obama administration's 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. This basically they're criticizing and they're blaming, of course, when Obama decided as a result of the negotiations to free the money up that was being controlled, going back to the sanctions regime. This is usually a typical Republican counting point, and the next administration should neither preserve nor repeat the mistakes of the Obama and Biden administrations. The correct policy for Iran is one that acknowledges that it is in U.S. national security interest, the Iranian people's human rights interests, and a broader global interest in peace and stability for the Iranian people to have the democratic government they demand. So they're talking about essentially a regime overthrow. And I'm going to stop there to get opinions because the next thing, of course, they're talking about is Venezuela. So anybody want to jump in with their comments about this? And I should add, you're listening to Project 2025 Study Group. We're talking about the part of the study group analysis that deals with foreign policy and particularly the Department of State and the intelligence community. Go on, Al.
It actually goes back to one of your first statements, which is about Trump distancing himself from the study. I wonder if the GOP is trying to distance itself from Trump. I saw numerous commercials on the Olympics last night about Harris, and it was all targeted against Harris, of course, but there was never a mention of who was running against Harris, and I found that very interesting. So one wonders if there are fissures within the Republican Party about who their candidate has wound up being, given who they have to sell.
Yeah, good point. And of course, we have the, frankly, from my point of view, and I guess others can share their opinion, essentially the PR disaster earlier this week when Trump appeared in front of the National Association of Black Journalists. But other people have comments about this before I can resume? Alex or Joan or Sally? Go on, Alex.
I mean, we saw when, Trump was president, they arguably accelerated the number of, so-called regime change operations around the world. Obviously Venezuela, but, also more quietly, what happened in Bolivia. So obviously they want to ramp that up with, specific mention of, Iran, Venezuela, but also Russia and even North Korea, which is absurd that, something would happen there. I think it's also interesting, the section on Russia, because again, they pose this third way, between between isolationism and interventionism that, somehow, that again emphasizes China is the greatest threat to U.S. interest, but wants to continue arming Ukraine, but now it must be fully paid for, and of course the Europeans, who are already kind of doing that, shouldering, I guess, the financial needs. And again, there's nothing here about what I would want to talk about, which is just the fact that as I see it, the U.S. is unable to, keep sending arms because we don't have the production to Ukraine. But again, that's a bigger question. But yeah, so Jim, if you want to.
Right. Anybody else want to jump in on this before I move on? All right, let me continue. Now, the issue of covert operations is very interesting too. It's something when we get to the intelligence community stuff, it's not really mentioned and emphasized, but I know that people went down and observed the election that just happened in Venezuela. And here we see, once a model of democracy and a true U.S. ally, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has all but collapsed under the communist regimes of the late Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. And they're talking about Venezuela has swung from being one of the most prosperous, if not the most prosperous country in South America, to being one of the poorest. Its communist leadership has also drawn closer to some of the United States' greatest international foes, including the People's Republic of China and Iran, who've long sought a foothold in the Americas. I think, if I recall, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the Chinese have even offered to base naval forces in the Venezuelan coastline. But anyway, this is, of course, we know, a major effort and objective not only of the Trump administration, but of the Obama administration. Obama administration was opposed to Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. But does anyone want to jump in on this before we go to Russia? All right, let me continue. So here we get into this question of Russia. Now, there are serious splits within the Republican Party. You have, for example, they were just pointing out how Trump down in Atlanta yesterday made a comment where he, praises Putin for releasing this deal that just occurred with the hostages, Dershowitz from the Wall Street Journal, other people traded for intelligence operatives, and this whole trade that just occurred. And some people are pointing out, the traditional GOP cold warriors, which Hal referred to earlier. This whole line of argumentation has essentially been minimized in the Republican Party as it is now. And then of course, you see it in the Democratic Party. So that bipartisan kind of approach to foreign policy, particularly in the Cold War period, has broken up. And here you have one school of conservative thought holds that is Moscow's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine drags on. Russia presents major challenges to U.S. interests. Then you have another school of thought that denies that U.S.-Ukrainian support is in the national interest of the United States at all. Ukraine is not a member of NATO and is one of the most corrupt nations in the region. So you have this dichotomy in terms of, and you can see it in the Republican Party. You can see it in our own domestic politics. And you can see that in international politics around the world, of course, because these kind of divisions have entered the domestic politics of European countries too. The tension between these competing divisions has given rise to a third approach. This conservative viewpoint basically throws off both isolationism and interventionism. Rather, each foreign policy decision must first ask what is in the interest of the American people. U.S. military engagement must clearly fall within U.S. interests, be fiscally responsible, and protect American freedom, liberty, and sovereignty, while all the while recognizing communist China is the greatest threat to U.S. interests. So again, this issue of China, maybe I can imitate the voice of Mr. Trump. China, I guess I can do a Queen's accent. That's something he, of course, is stressing, and again, requires more rigorous analysis to break down. Mike, you wanted to comment. I see you unmuted. Michael Bressler?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Sorry,
All right. Now, and don't hesitate. Just do the old little Zoom thing. Raise your hand there, and I'll bring in. Now, then we get to the question of the DPRK. Now, this is a long issue in American foreign policy, going back to the end of the Second World War, and we know at Suvla that we had Kim in the north and Sigmund Rhee in the south. There was an attempt to launch a guerrilla war in the 1940s that was repressed by the U.S. aid. And then, of course, the invasion of South Korea that was organized by, was sort of there's all these new scholarship in the past 30 years that talks about how Stalin actually took a personal interest in making sure that the campaign to overrun South Korea was fast and rapid. And it wasn't, of course, the United Nations. The United States was able to get the UN to basically rubber stamp a multilateral intervention, which came in, and then the Korean War ensued and was essentially a stalemate. Now, that political division has lasted to the present. And one can talk about, the back and forth with the DPRK going back into all these different crisis points. We came close to nuclear war during the Clinton administration with DPRK, and again, the DPRK then decided to evolve and create nuclear capability, which they now have. And so here you have this question of Trump, of course, had his own little love affair with Kim Jong-un, and so you have this interesting question of what will happen if Trump is elected to the White House in relationship with the DPRK. People are also talking openly about, well, what's going to happen? Is he going to essentially, if Taiwan is invaded, because again, there's this whole question of the Chinese, the People's Republic, getting the capability to actually launch an invasion in 2027. If you look at what goes on constantly in these air skirmishes that occur, and they're not fighting, but there's this constant use of Chinese air power to essentially envelop Taiwan and then place carrier task forces to the east of the island to demonstrate, okay, we can blockade you anytime we want. And that kind of crisis is where we're heading. But again, you have to have common sense at the international level between the United States and all these different countries to de-escalate. But of course, the Chinese reacted negatively to the election in in Taiwan recently, that had a government come into power that is against, basically opposed to them being integrated. Go on. What are you going to say, Hal?
Well, you mentioned the breakdown of the bipartisan Cold War foreign policy, and at times it was bipartisan. But when I look at this Republican part, when I look at Trump and his 40% now, it's taking the McCarthyism that the Republican Party used to beat the heads of the Democrats with for decades and decades, as supposedly being weak on defense and weak on communism, tossing it out the window and almost embracing it. I mean, you have Trump with his love affair of Putin in his first administration, to the point where, I mean, fortunately for the Ukrainians, Biden was in power by the time the Russians actually invaded, because I don't think Trump would have assisted at all. And I don't know what dirty deals he and his advisors have made with the Russians. But my talk about this being so surreal is you had this Republican Party that used to be basically anti-Soviet and has now seemingly embraced the successor, who was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB. You have all this talk about North Korea, and I frankly don't think North Korea or Iran are threats to U.S. national security. I don't think they ever have been, even if they have nukes. I just don't see it. I do see China as the number one threat, but to me, it's just completely. I mean, it's full speed amidships with their current policies. Just complete mystery is where these have come from.
Yeah, it is. It is a different kind of situation. Now, does anybody else want to jump in with comments about this?
Yeah. This is Mike Bressler. I just wanted to
Sure.
mention that I think this deal on the prisoners, again, like I mentioned in the chat, I think is a sign that maybe Putin is. I mean, I think Trump was in hock to Putin, but maybe Putin is, getting a bit frustrated with him and his incompetence, and just turning cold on him.
On Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, some people were saying that this was sort of, I see some reportage along those lines. Does anybody else want to jump in on this before I continue? Okay, just to let people know what we're doing here. My name is Jim Dingman. We're in the third session of the Project 2025 study group. We're right now examining the part of the book that deals with, or the compilation of policy papers that deals with the State Department and the intelligence community. And essentially, it goes through a laundry list of, their attitudes towards different parts of the world. So it's sort of interesting to look at this. Now, here you get into this question of the Western Hemisphere. Now, I don't have to tell you that there has been a sea shift in Latin America in the past 20 years. Maduro's not just one manifestation of it, but there's all these different uh, governments that have come to power throughout Latin America that are, quote, not necessarily aligned completely with the United States politically and ideologically. I mean, we could get into specifics on that. So Latin America is sort of an interesting mixture of nationalist, populist, leftist regimes that have come to power. And here you have the United States has a vested interest in a relatively united and economically prosperous Western Hemisphere. Nevertheless, the region now has an overwhelming number of socialist or progressive regimes which are at odds with the freedom and growth-oriented policies of the U.S. and other neighbors, and who increasingly pose hemispheric security threats. Now, in this discussion here, they don't talk about covert operations, intelligence operations. I'm a keen student for decades of covert operations in American foreign policy. But some of you may or may not know that. Alex certainly does, and Bruce might. I used to help John Prados, the late John Prados, do his books on the CIA. So, and I'm talking about doing it from a scholarly point of view, not, I have great respect for covert action, but I have a different attitude towards this procedure than they do. So that's always been a tool of American foreign policy. And I have no doubt that we are actively involved in all sorts of different covert operations to prevent and counter these trends in Latin America. I think it's a no-brainer to argue that. So here you have some of the core policies here. A sovereign Mexico policy. So Mexico can no longer qualify as a first world nation. It has functionally lost its sovereignty to muscular criminal cartels that effectively run the country. Now, one of the things that the Trump defense policy people talk about is a need to mount military operations into Mexico to attack the cartels openly. And they talk about actually deploying significant amounts of the American military to the southern border, not only to protect it, but to launch operations against the cartels that run and send fentanyl into the United States. Now, again, the whole drug war issue, the whole cartel issue, that is an amazing topic to argue because it spills over into all sorts of other issues, such as the basic thing that the basic problem is American demand for drugs that exists, and the whole economic and cultural and political aspects of this granularly in the United States, culturally, and how it manifests itself, the drug culture, etc. But go on, Alex. What are you going to say?
Yeah, no, specifically, Mexico. This, goes with what several senators in particular have said about, we need to invade Mexico, which I know personally I see as an attempt to cripple Mexico's economy, which is doing quite well actually, and is actually, under their, President AMLO and the new president, they're probably they're greatly reducing poverty. They have good, strong growth. So I think this is, well, the cynical part of me says that this is an effort to stop that and to, make sure we reimpose our hegemony over Mexico. But yeah, I also see that they're indulging in the China fentanyl conspiracy theory here, which maybe you go into next.
Yeah, anybody else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a good part of what's going on in Mexico is also due to the flooding of into Mexico of American guns,
Right.
basically. And I don't think that's been pointed out enough.
That's a really good point. There's an anthropologist at Brown University who sent me a copy of her book just on that subject. And it's a very interesting book because all it talks about is precisely that issue, how the weapons get sold. People come up into the United States, they buy them because, in the southern states of the United States, you can essentially buy whatever the hell you want. And they come back and import them and use them in their cartel wars. Now, the fentanyl issue, I do take seriously. I've known people who had drug problems throughout my life. I'm sure all of us do. So I don't underestimate the problem of drug addiction. In the past it was heroin addiction. Now it's fentanyl. Uh, I don't dispute that as a serious social problem domestically. However, I always have my problem with these weaponization strategies when they talk about the drug war, and usually the issue is to militarize the border. This goes on back to the Nixon administration, certainly the Reagan administration, when you had an even increased militarization of the border. And there's a lot of studies about this. But anyway, so here's their argument here about a fentanyl-free frontier. Then the question of industry and energy. Now, here you get into this whole question of, first, the United States must do everything possible with both resources and messaging to shift global manufacturing industry from more distant points around the globe to Central and South American countries. Now, that's sort of an interesting comment, because any of us who have a rudimentary knowledge of the globalization of the American economy, starting from the end of the Second World War and accelerating through the 60s and 70s, all the supply chains were basically, for many reasons, moved from the southern states abroad for basically the purposes of oligopolistic monopoly capital to basically, take advantage of labor costs around the world and, reduce their expenses and increase their profits. So I find that fascinating, that they want to sort of bring everything back into the Americas as a policy prescription to bring the supply chain back into the Western Hemisphere, when we know it's a global supply chain. I mean, for every kind of thing, even weapons. American weapons are created with a global supply chain. So it's an interesting little prescription here. The U.S. must work with Mexico and Canada and other countries to develop a hemisphere-focused energy policy that will reduce reliance on distant and manipulable sources of fossil fuels. Now, again, that gets into the climate change question, because then if you want to have this sort of integrated energy policy in between North America and South America, then you have to, basically throw global climate change strictures out the door completely. And they don't mention any of this. A local approach to security threats. Okay, so Western Hemispheric nations arguably have stronger cultural and historical ties to the U.S. than most other countries and regions in the world, yet Central and South America are moving rapidly into the sphere of anti-American external state actors, including the People's Republic of China, Iran, and Russia. Specifically, countries in the Americas such as Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, and Ecuador are either increasingly regional security threats in their own rights or are vulnerable to hostile external continental powers. So the United States has an opportunity to lead those democratic neighbors to fight against the external. So here we have a situation ripe for U.S. interventionism and not dealing with the fundamental causes to why these countries decide to, quote, break from Western and American hegemony.
Jim,
yeah, go on, Alex.
Just, this, of course, this is something, for the Democrats, too, that the greatest external threat to, Central and South America is the United States, and has always been. Well, since, definitely since the late 19th century. So it's, absurd to talk about, helping them against external threats when we are the external threat. But again, that's something that, applies to more conventional Republicans, even, Democrats. They're just as bad on this. But yeah.
Well, yeah, and of course, the Monroe Doctrine was to basically keep European powers out of the, quote, hemisphere, so the United States could essentially dominate and turn the Caribbean into a Caribbean American lake. And then, at that point, when the Monroe Doctrine's issued, we're facing, when you sort of integrate that to certain problems that lead to the war with Mexico in 1847, that was also designed to keep England and France out of supporting Santa Anna. And, this desire to maintain hegemony goes way back into American history. Now let's turn to the Middle East, which is what is in front of us right now. So here you have a question of the U.S. must prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear technology and delivery capabilities, and more broadly block Iranian ambitions. So we could look at what's going on right now in this situation that is continuing in the Middle East. Just a few days ago, in the Israeli press, they were openly talking about. They had cabinet officials who were part of the Netanyahu cabinet openly saying that Netanyahu's not interested in a peace settlement right now. He's not interested in having the hostages come home. He is desiring to maintain power because he knows that if election occurs, he will be ousted and then subject to criminal sanctions. He has a whole criminal case that is on hold right now because of this crisis after October 7th. So that part of what's going on here has to be put into the mix. Now, the question of Iran acquiring nuclear technology and delivery capabilities and more broadly block Iranian ambitions, we've been in a state of a active Cold War with Iran since the revolutions in 1979. We've been engaged in military conflict with their allies, sometimes directly, ever since 1979. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, down there in Yemen, all these kind of situations. The situation right now with Gaza, Israel, and all these, there's been constant action, military conflict with Iran since then. And so the question here becomes how you look at this issue here of, quote, blocking Iranian ambitions. And then the question is, do you see what's occurring with Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as simply a mechanism of Iranian foreign policy? I don't. I think the Iranian foreign policy is part of the picture. But of course, if you're going to sit there and look at Hamas and take its creation out of political and historical context, then you dismiss the question of how this is essentially an evolution of Palestinian resistance over decades. Same thing with Hezbollah in the case of Lebanon, and the same thing with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. How we're going to settle this, how this can be peacefully resolved, that's a whole other issue. But nevertheless, here you see them talking about right away, we have to confront Iran. Then the administration built on Trump administration's diplomatic successes by encouraging other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, to enter the Abraham Accords. Now, that, of course, that whole structure and framework has essentially been put on hold or even questioned with all the events since October 7th. I read and study very carefully public opinion in the Arab countries. I've been doing that for decades. And what's clear now is if you look at Arab opinion in different parts of the country, different parts of the Middle East, it is at complete variance with even the most common sense or moderate kind of proposals being talked about to solve this problem right now, a two-state solution. There is no political support within Palestinians at this point for a two-state solution in both. You look at the opinion polls in Gaza and West Bank, but more importantly throughout the Middle East in terms of all the different countries domestically. So regimes engaging in these kind of negotiations have to keep in mind they could face another Arab Spring kind of phenomenon occurring. Now, so again, here you have them wanting to build on their successes with the Abraham Accords. We know that's associated with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. The question of degradation of long-standing partnership with Saudi Arabia, and I question that. That is, Saudi Arabia, for example, look at what just happened in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Chinese intervened as an interlocutor in the past couple of months. And they essentially, if one recalls, tried to, they're acting as, quote, a, middle man. And now they argue the Palestinian Authority should be defunded. Now that, of course, is ridiculous because what are you going to do? Who's going to what if you take away money? The Palestinian Authority. Another question is legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. Anyone who follows this conflict knows that Palestinian Authority, in general, is highly unpopular both on the West Bank and Gaza. And if there was an election today, Hamas would probably get in power with popular support in both the West Bank and Gaza. You have the issue of Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is also conflicted. Turkey would sometimes have a policy that would hedge itself with Israel, That seems to have disappeared right now. And, Turkey used to be, quote, a balancing force in the complexity of the Arab-Israeli Palestine conflict. Now it's more clearly, and due to domestic reasons and the regional reasons, on the side of the Palestinians. And here you have also this question of what's going on in Iraq. The Axis of Resistance has decided to resuscitate its operations in Syria and Iraq against the Americans. And so we're going to see probably more raids occurring, certainly after what just happened last week with the assassination in Tehran and in Beirut. So again, the question of what kind of Middle East security policy is going to be built is an interesting problem. Finally, the U.S. national interest to build a Middle East security pact that includes Israel, Egypt, the Gulf states, and potentially India as a second Quad arrangement. Now, they're talking about there's a quadrilateral structure that some argue about that's been accompanying the discussions to have a Middle East peace settlement, if you will. And here you see this question of what's going to happen with the Red Sea, because the Houthis have been quite successful in operating and interdicting and screwing up commercial traffic through the Suez Canal. And so, again, they're saying that is related to the Gaza-Israel problem, which we'll see if there's a resolution. But we know, as I mentioned, that Netanyahu is obviously banking on Trump getting reelected, so he can essentially ignore that kind of push to have a settlement. So we'll see what happens with all this. And the question of human rights. The U.S. cannot neglect a concern for human rights and minority rights. They must balance this with strategic and security considerations. The question of what happened to the Christian minorities in Iraq was, despicable with ISIS when they killed all these Christians. And, I tend to have my own sympathy about that. But nevertheless, they become pawns in the wider game of the United States. Now they turn to Africa. Go on, Alex.
Two things on that. Yeah, that was Christian. Well, first off, to support Middle East Christians, you would have to, oppose what Israel is doing in Gaza now, and in, the Palestinian territories in general. Also, we can see, multiple cases of, the U.S. covertly supporting, the jihadi terrorists who attack, like what we did in Syria, but also Iraq, and historically, Robert Dreyfus has a great book on this that talks about, the long history of CIA support for fundamentalism in the Middle East in the 20th century. That gets into this if people want to look it up.
Yeah, that book starts, although one have to take that book with a little bit of a grain of salt, because he starts with the 1950s and the relationship of U.S. foreign policy to conservative Islamic political formulations. They're not backing the Salafist type of solution, which is what we see with someone like bin Laden. But that's an interesting topic to perhaps do another discussion down the road. Now, here we're talking about Africa. Now, Africa is in the next 20 to 30 years, for all sorts of reasons, explosive population growth. Africa is going to have a disproportionately larger part of the population in the world in the next 20 or 30 years. There's this whole question of mineral resources. The other issues that come up is, the buying power of Africa. I mean, the sort of kind of globalization questions that happened with China in the past 50 years could definitely be extrapolated into Africa. That is, you could actually see the, quote, rise of a consumer class that could act, and certainly Nigeria would want to do that. But there's all these internal situations and problems that manifest against that. But the U.S. influence there has declined. Now, of course, they're talking about, look at what's happened in Niger and Mali and throughout the Sahel. There's been these governments, populist military governments, so essentially thrown the United States out in these countries. And the Chinese, with the Belt and Road Initiative, have gone into these areas of the world And there's this, when I was in Nigeria in 2008 for a month, and what blew my mind was everybody in the universities I was at, it was up there about 100 miles north of Lagos, excuse me, primarily in the Christian area of Nigeria, southwestern Nigeria. Everybody was learning Chinese. They were all enthusiastically learning Chinese because of the extension of soft aid to Nigeria that was, and remember, America has pulled out of the programs that they had during the Cold War, which of course can be, essentially looked down as, adjuncts to American imperialism, but they pulled out of even the most rudimentary kind of humanitarian or aid type of policies compared to per capita what they did in the 1950s and 60s. And China, of course, has filled that vacuum. So there you have these areas where there's great competition with the United States and the Chinese inside Africa itself. The Belt and Road Initiative is alive and well in Africa. African nations comprise major country bloc elements that shield the PRC and Russia from international isolation for their human rights abuses. And they staunchly support Chinese foreign policy goals on issues such as Hong Kong, South China Seas, dispute arbitration, and Taiwan. So there's all this alignment that particularly is accelerated after the war in Ukraine began, where you see these global shifts, sort of a new neo-Bandung kind of phenomena happening in the world after the invasion in 2022 by Russia of Ukraine. A very interesting phenomenon going on globally. So they're talking about shifting strategic focus from assistance to growth. They want to counter Chinese activity on the continent. They want to counter the furtherance of terrorism. Now, Boko Haram, I'm no fan of Boko Haram's, and I've, talked about it. I've written about it. I've listened to people from Nigeria discuss it, and but again, these are responses to the failure of these societies to meet certain kind of basic needs. I mean, the Boko Haram arose as a phenomena in northeastern Nigeria as a result of ham-fisted policies by the central government. There's no doubt about it. And you have to sort of look on the whole rise of Islamic fundamentalism in a different kind of way. And then the question of, there is a question of, now here's something interesting. They want to extend their anti-abortion and LGBT attitudes towards foreign policy in Africa. So any kind of common sense birth control measures have to be rejected in a new Trump administration. African nations are particularly non-receptive to the U.S. policies such as abortion and pro-LGBT initiatives being imposed on them. The United States should focus. And there's one example that's in Uganda, where Uganda has a very repressive domestic policy towards gay people. And frankly, I'm in favor of the United States taking a critical look at countries that act like this. But they're saying throw that out, the hell with it. Let's basically, and also throw out our birth control and pro-abortion policies that essentially help the economic development, family planning, help the economic development of these countries. They want to throw that out. Now, Europe. Any comments about Africa before we move on? All right. Now, Europe. Again, we're sort of going through a laundry list here of what they want to do. Now, you get back to this question of Trump when he was criticizing NATO, that they were not contributing more to their GDP for defense. So you get into this question. At stake after 2024 will be examining the status of the Wales pledge of 2% of gross GDP towards defense by NATO members. Now, there's a big increase in defense spending by the different European powers. They make a big deal sometimes about the Germans not going all the way up there. But again, these countries have domestic political situations that are different than what happens in the United States. And the fact is that in reality, they have indeed increased their amount of GDP going to defense. And in fact, the bulk of the troops used in NATO are non-American. So this whole it's fascinating to hear these arguments being made by Trump about this. Transatlantic trade is a significant part of the global economy and is a national interest of the United States to amplify it. Because it means this is a weaning of Europe of its dependence on China. Now, again, the question of trade policy again, these are issues. The political economy issues are ones that I think are not dealt with in a sophisticated way in this study, and again require a more granular and more nuanced look. Some of the arguments they make, I've listened to people critique their policy objectives, and some of them are just simplistic idiocy on the part of the Republicans in these kind of policy debates, because they ignore practical considerations about Chinese export policy into Europe. But we can go into that another time in greater detail. That's probably be interesting to do separately from all this when we're finished with this. And then the question of Brexit. UN foreign policy, EU foreign policy takes place without UK input, with disadvantage to the United States, given that the UK has historically been aligned with many US positions. So therefore, the US should be more attentive to inter-EU developments, which also develops new allies inside the EU, especially the Central European countries on the eastern flank of the EU. We see that going on right now, by the way. That's going on in this situation reacting to the war in Ukraine in 2022. Ever since to the present, there's a whole reaction in NATO, and it's of course appearing itself in the elections inside Europe itself. People might have seen on PBS this documentary that Frontline did about domestic politics in Germany. I recommend that, because not everybody. It's sort of interesting, the neo-isolationism that one sees in Europe. Has many complicated roots, but in some ways similar to the United States in the sense it's related to deindustrialization kind of issues that are similar to, if you look at what the whole Trump phenomena, that's in part due to deindustrialization. That's one of the factors one has to include. And I think that that's interesting to look at in the case of Europe. Now, here you get in South and Central Asia. India plays a crucial role in countering the Chinese threat and securing a free and open Indo-Pacific. They quote this DoD study, 2019, the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, noticing that the Indian Ocean is the nexus of global trade and commerce, with nearly half of the 90,000 commercial vessels and 2/3 of global oil trade traveling through its sea lanes. They talk about transnational terrorism. They refer to the defeat in Afghanistan. We have to reset the deeply troubled U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and we have to intervene and de-escalate tensions between India and Pakistan. Also, the question of dealing with the Taliban. U.S. policy must be clear-eyed and realistic about the perfidiousness of the Taliban regime. There can be no expectation of normal relations with either. Of course, they refer to the military political rule in Pakistan. Now, the Arctic Circle. Now, this is, I have to relay a very funny story about this. I attended a conference maybe 10 years ago on the question of what's going to happen in the Arctic Circle when you have the Arctic Circle basically melt. And it was sort of ridiculous because these guys got up there and pointed out that the Russians have 2 brigades of troops along a 2,000-mile frontier. And I said, well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? 2,000, you have 2 brigades of troops along 2,000 miles. What's a strategic threat? What are they going to do? Occupy penguins? What are they going to do? Move into the Arctic Circle? But this is an interesting issue because the question of oil up there, 90 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic, 1/4 of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves. The Arctic is lightly populated. Only 4 million people live above the Arctic Circle. So that's an interesting question. And that also gets into global climate change issues. Okay? Because one has to look at all the questions of why the ice is melting at the rates it's doing, and how that's going to, if we haven't even, that's a whole separate subject to get into later in these studies. The next administration should embrace the view that NATO must acknowledge that it is in part an Arctic alliance. You'll see, by the way, that there's increased number of training maneuvers going up in the northern part of Norway. In the past couple of years, the Marines always have gone up there and exercised in the Narvik area, but that's accelerated. So there's more NATO exercises going on up in the Arctic Circle area. And the United States should unapologetically pursue American interests in the Arctic by promoting economic freedom in the region. Another thing that was brought in this conference was they wanted the Coast Guard to increase the amount of icebreaker ships that were up there. And there was an icebreaker missile gap, if you will. It was sort of amusing to listen to that argument. But anyway, and now China has declared itself a near Arctic state. So there's just something to keep in mind. So you have this sort of global sense of the Trump administration presenting its view of the world. Now, in international organizations, this is an interesting looking. Keep in mind, there's that strand, the Republican Party, going back into the Second World War, of isolationism and its reaction to international organizations in general, like the United Nations. There's always been attacks against the United Nations. They got wrapped up in the McCarthy period. They considered, remember, Alger Hiss is somebody who actually had a strong role in the State Department in terms of constructing the ideas, the intellectual architecture of the United Nations. And remember, he was attacked and condemned and pilloried as an agent of international communism during the Cold War. So international organizations have always been a target for those kind of right-wing sentiments in our culture and society and politics. Here you have engagement with international organizations as one relative easy way for the U.S. to defend its interest. And so they're talking here about the U.S. must end blind support for international organizations. So they should, basically, they're attacking the WHO and its policy during the COVID pandemic. I don't want to get into an argument with anti-vaxxers here about this, but here you see this issue of Trump trying to pull out of international organizations that they would conceive to be not in conducive with American national interests as they see them. So the Trump administration withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Educational, Science, and Cultural Organization, the UN, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, and the World Health Organization. They basically want to repeat that. They want to reverse what Biden did when he reinitiated those kind of, policy initiatives back into play. The international organization should not be used to promote radical social policies as if they were human rights priorities. Again, that gets into a question that we can argue about what human rights is, what are radical social policies? Is it abortion is considered by them, of course, a radical social policy. And here you get they sort of do boilerplate here. UN Commission on Unalienable Human Rights. They want to basically foster a consensus that's anti-abortion as a foreign policy objective. The U.S. led an effort during the Trump administration to forge a consensus among like-minded countries in support of human life, women's health, support of the family as the basic unit of human society, and defense of national sovereignty. The result of this was the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Women's Health Protection, Health and Protection of the Family. So they want to sort of internationalize their domestic policies against abortion by creating bodies that actually implement that. They talk about the pandemic, and again, that's a whole other question. Who's to blame for the pandemic? I don't think we're going to have an easy answer to that in the near future. And again, they want to reorganize the State Department. Now, the State Department will be one of the many institutions that they subject to essentially a forced reduction of civil servants. They want to knock out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of civil servants in the federal bureaucracy. So they want to develop for the State Department a reorganization strategy that will make more than cosmetic changes to the State Department. They want to basically create an ideological. They want to look at this. They want to tighten accountability to political leadership, reduce overhead, eliminate redundancy, waste. Again, some of these measures one wouldn't disagree with. Of course, you want to cut costs. However, tighten accountability to political leadership. They want to consolidate foreign assistance authorities. foreign assistance is a critical foreign policy tool. They want that to be supporting the foreign policy agenda of the bureaucracy. They always go back to the first year they came into power in 2017, where they didn't have their act together, so to speak. Make public diplomacy, international broadcasting serve American interests. So they want, and that's nothing new. I mean, that's been going on since the Voice of America was started in 1942, and the U.S. Information Agency. So that's not a big structural change. The Democrats and Republicans have done these kind of things. Engage in cyber diplomacy. Again, all parties in power are doing this. They want to use the model for cyberspace that the U.S. espouses is based on democracy and freedom of information. They want to use that as a social media propaganda tool, the same way the Chinese and the Russians do. That's just a function of statecraft these days. So that's the conclusion for their discussion about the State Department. And again, you're listening to Project 2025. My name is Jim Dingman. We're talking about the issues of Project 2025 that deal with the State Department and the intelligence community. Now, any comments or questions about the State Department issues or foreign policy issues we've talked about?
I always think about like how you can keep the United States, China, and Russia out of all the other countries, because they create all this turmoil, and then the people want to leave there. And we have so many issues now with people have nowhere to live. They have not enough food to eat. We have the climate destroying places and all. And all we think about is how we can go in and kill people, or how we can go in and get, the resources and not help anybody. I know that's a naive look at it, but I don't know. I always thought that the UN was going to be this place where everybody could get together and talk, and the UN is absolutely like nothing. Has done nothing all these years.
Well, thank you, Joan. Any other comments? Yeah, go on, Al.
Well, the UN was not allowed to do anything. I mean, the UN was designed to do what its members wanted to do, and international organizations don't run international relations. Nations do. And the UN's not going to be able to do anything if its member states don't agree. The U.S. didn't help by defunding its contributions, 40 years ago? Something like that.
Yeah, right. Go on, Sally.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems is the Security Council with our endless vetoes of, that if the UN is going to work, that needs to be abolished. And I don't see our country going along with that anytime soon.
Yeah, no, they always will. There's, of course, this big move to reform the Security Council and change it dramatically, but I don't see the United States agreeing to that at all in the near future. Anybody else like Bruce, Mike, or Carolyn, or Claire? Do you want to jump in with any comments? Go on, Mike.
Well, one thing I just kind of highlighted was the part where we talked about, the emphasis on creating greater allies in Central Europe, in the EU, and to my mind, that kind of really brought up Hungary, and now Slovakia is very similar. Poland also, until the last election, these were kind of becoming a very ideologically right-wing bloc within the EU, and it's also going to, in a way, test U.S. Should this ever be followed, which it's I don't know, it's kind of a blueprint that's kind of been dismissed by Trump, but it's there for him taking whatever he wants to. But you have this this is a ready-made blueprint for shifting from, support, say, from the Ukraine to, well, away to a more pro-Putin type policy, in my view.
Interesting. Go on, Alex.
Yeah. One thing I kind of notice is what they don't talk about. One thing of which is clear again, the words, and I don't think anywhere else in the document, BRICS don't appear, even though, of course, BRICS is increasingly important in in the world and in foreign policy. I mean, the fact that they don't even mention it, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is. I mean, again, I don't know if the Democrats are equally obtuse on that, but I think that's a notable, missing part of it. The other thing is the lack of any reference to what they probably would call sanctions, but unilateral coercive measures, which of course are illegal, when not approved by the UN. Unless it's mentioned somewhere like in the Department of Treasury, but that they don't say anything about, either, well, we want to increase that, we want to stop that, I mean, it just shows, again, the many things that they, don't even want to talk about, even though these are, very important issues in world affairs and our foreign policy. I think that's just glaring. But again, I think this is something that, again, the Democrats are certainly on sanctions, are no better than Trump would be. So, but yeah.
Yeah, the political economy aspects to this, that's a very significant critique because, I haven't seen so far in what we've read any kind of sophisticated integration of that into their analysis. It's sort of, let's figure out how to take over the bureaucracy of the executive branch and all the departments for our foreign policy agenda, which they clearly state in what we've seen so far. Because we haven't even hit the controversial parts, the even more controversial parts that have to do with domestic policy yet. But anyway, any other comments before I continue into the intelligence community? Bruce, you want to say something? Or Carolyn? All right. I'll continue. All right. So, again, what you're listening to, my name is Jim Dingman. This is the Project 2025 study group. This is session 3. And we're looking at the parts of the document, the 2025 Mandate for Leadership, commonly known as the Project 2025 report, that deal with the State Department and the intelligence community. We've just been reviewing for the past hour the whole question of the State Department. Now we're going to launch into the intelligence community aspects of this. Now, again, the U.S. intelligence community is a vast, intricate bureaucracy with 18 different cabinet sub-agencies and independent agencies. I'm quoting the document itself. According to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, the IC's mission is to collect, analyze, and deliver foreign intelligence and counterintelligence information to America's leaders so they can make sound decisions to protect our country. An incoming president, a conservative president, they make that clear, needs to use these intelligence authorities aggressively to anticipate and thwart our adversaries, including Russia, Iran, North Korea, and especially China, while maintaining counterterrorism tools that have demonstrated their effectiveness. This means empowering the right personnel to manage, build, and effectively execute actions dispersed through the intelligence community to deliver intelligence in an ever-challenging world. And they talk about all the different things that the intelligence community can do. Now, what's interesting about this is they immediately bring up the question of groupthink, the unintended consequences of the intelligence community spending too much time overcorrecting its past mistakes is that it includes hesitancy, groupthink, and an overly cautious approach that allows personal incentives to drive preset courses. The intelligence community must be perceived as a depoliticized protector of America's civil rights and security. Now, that's, of course, you'll see that that's a contradiction with what they talk about. The intelligence community must start to look forward, not backwards. Unfortunately, the major strategic threat to the United States is a nation-state peer and possibly ahead of the U.S. in strategic areas, referring to, of course, to China. Okay. So the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was set up after 9/11. Now, what was that? It was done, others can chime in on this. It was done essentially because they in their aftermath of looking at what happened in 9/11, they were critiquing the way that the intelligence was siloized. It wasn't shared. There was no overarching integration of all the information. And that led to them not picking up signs such as, oh, why are these guys practicing? Why is the FBI reporting that these guys are practicing to fly at certain levels, which can only, if you extrapolate that with other information, well, what are they planning to do? Are they planning to take an airplane into a building? And all these kind of issues that were raised by all the different investigations of intelligence. Go on, Al.
Yeah, it's what Alex just pointed out as well. I mean, just the whole notion that people understand that when the NID was created, I mean, the commission report found there was too much bureaucracy. There were too many agencies. There weren't. So the logic was to create the NID to coordinate everything. But all it did was create, I think, 2 additional agencies. They went from 16 to 18. It was even more bureaucracy. I mean, by the way, the purpose of the Central Intelligence Agency after World War II was to coordinate things because the Army and the Navy weren't talking to each other before Pearl Harbor. And, right. You know, the only thing they could agree on is hating the State Department and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's just been this creeping level of bureaucracy, levels, numbers of agencies. And this was just the latest layer of it.
Now, they refer here that these reforms are similar to the Goldwater-Nichols Act reforms of the late 1980s. Now, that was, of course, Senator Goldwater. And what that did was led to unified combatant commands with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a senior ranking member of the armed forces. Now, I would argue that unified combatant commands, that's what I was referring to earlier. The whole question of, like, let's say, having Central Command, Africa Command, all these different European, all these different command structures within the armed forces, basically usurping the power of the State Department, which is what critics of it would argue. This has been going on ever since the end, since the World War II and on afterwards. I mean, I would argue this starts during the Second World War and continues to the present. But the Goldwater-Nichols Act also that was when we had the reorganization of special operations in the American military. That's when you began to see, this is in the aftermath of the Desert One fiasco in 1979, when they launched a commando raid to free the hostages in Tehran, and that was a big failure. And so there were a whole big arguments, Delta forces created before that operation happens. And there's a whole big argument to synchronize and put on a more sound basis special operations. And then you have the creation of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. Now, JSOC has grown to an organization, I believe, at least, 67. I mean, they have all the special operations communities of all the armed forces integrated under their command. However, it gives the president a very effective tool to intervene in a clandestine fashion and do his best to hide that as far as possible from congressional scrutiny. Now, again, people will argue that that's not the case. They have the ability to do that through the different intelligence communities in the Senate and the House, where they have a handful of senators and congressmen who are given special access to the covert operations that are launched by the United States government. However, JSOC does give the power of the president and the executive branch to do things clandestinely in an even more sophisticated fashion than they did. And so remember the famous comment made from the Supreme, I think the Supreme Court, was it? Oh, in front of Justice Chutkan, when one guy was, someone can correct me, it's either the Supreme Court or Justice Chutkan down in Washington, or the appeals court in Washington, when some guy was asked, well, suppose SEAL Team 6 is launched to do an operation. and kill someone that the president orders, an opposing political person. Is that considered a example of the executive branch that needs to be put under control? And basically, if you recall, the guy with the counsel for Trump basically said, no, of course not. That the president can do whatever he wants, including send SEAL Team 6 in to kill domestic people. So domestic competitors. So that's, and again, we're going to see next week, I think Judge 𝗦𝗀𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀 is going to resuscitate that immunity case in Washington in some limited way. So that's going to be interesting to see how that affects everything. So the question of 911 commission. So we have this commission after 911, again, a controversial commission. I remember when Philip Zelikow, I've listened to Philip Zelikow talk. He teaches at the University of Virginia. And he warned in a 2004 hearing that creating a new agency lacking any existing institutional base would require authorities at least as strong as, Zelikow was warning that ODNI could become a fifth wheel. But Zelikow, of course, when you read his studies about the 911 Commission, he was essentially acting as a gatekeeper to prevent certain kind of questions being asked. So Zelikow's not some, innocent factor in this explanation here they're giving. Robert Gates was asked to become the first choice of DNI under Bush II, and he declined. And again, the question of how they're going to coordinate the intelligence community. Now, the ODNI, the Office of basically in charge of the whole intelligence community, he needs to direct, not replicate, the other ICE intelligence community's analytical, operational, and management functions. So they're talking about where the power of this is to go, who's going to coordinate what. Now, here, of course, are these ridiculous comments they make. Future intelligence community leadership must address the widely promoted woke culture that has spread through the federal government, with identity politics and social justice advocacy replacing such traditional American values as patriotism, colorblindness, and even workplace competence. Now, I would say, you know what? I think social justice advocacy is as American as apple pie, and so as far as I'm concerned, it's a patriotic thing to argue for social justice, and so this is all this kind of conservative culture war bullshit that they love to argue. But anyway, let me put my language at a different level. So Executive Order 12333. This is the president's implementation to improve. This is an executive order issued by George Bush. This is where we get into these questions of the global war on terrorism, etc. And they were, of course, reacting to 911. So they need to amend this executive order. The emphasis on the intelligence community with this executive order was on international terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. They have to revise it and then address cyberspace issues. They have to revise it and enhance the DNI's role in overseeing the execution of the National Intelligence Program budget on the president's authority. Now, here again, these questions of how they're trying to further shape in. It's ironic they started this off with attacking groupthink, but I would argue here they are basically on the path to groupthink. They want to clarify the DNI's role as leader of the intelligence community as an enterprise in building the IC's capabilities around its open source collection and analytical missions. Again, so the question of OSINT, open source intelligence information. I'm a big fan of OSINT. I think that's very important for the public's right to know. But they want to sit there and further, and here it is, a little giveaway, the DNI should appoint the principal deputy director of national intelligence as chairman. Now these are positions they want as political appointees. And in sort of amusing way, they want to prioritize security clearance reform. Now, they got upset when some of their members of the executive branch couldn't pass a security check. Trump can't pass a security check. I mean, let's be blunt. Anybody who offered a penthouse apartment to to President Putin, if that guy was put through a security check by the FBI, I don't think they'd give him a classified clearance. You're going to give President Putin a 2-story. I think he was going to give him 2 floors in the Trump Tower they're going to build in Moscow. That kind of relationship would be looked on as a little queasy. But here they want to basically fast track the security clearances so that they can put people in charge in these organizations that they're politically loyal to them, and they want to negate that. Proper vetting to speed the onboarding of personnel with much needed expertise is vital to the IC's future. That is a code word for let's get our political appointees into the deep state as fast as possible, and the hell with normal vetting procedures. Normally, if somebody goes for a security clearance to the government, it's about a year to get a security clearance. So that always, and you consider some of the characters that get security clearances always blow my mind. Anyway, they want to ensure the DNI's authority and provide additional material. And now we get to the CIA. Okay. So the next president-elect and incoming presidential personnel office should identify a director nominee who can foster a mission-driven culture by making necessary personnel and structural changes. And what the hell does that mean? This includes halting all current hiring to prevent the burrowing in of outgoing political personnel. So in other words, if you get some guy who is, competent, appointed by a Biden administration, they don't want the guy to then shift into the civil service. They want to purge those guys out. The director should request briefings on all CIA activities and presence overseas, as well any CIA-controlled access programs and existing covert action programming findings without exception. They always do that. That's nothing new. Any new director and deputy director does that. The NSC does that. The Security Council does that. The deputy director and director should meet with all directorates prior to, again, here you get into this question of calibrating collection and operations based on the president's intelligence requirements. And what are going to be the intelligence requirements of President of Trump in a second administration? What are his? Because we know that President Trump, you sit there and read these open source analyses of his PDPs, his presidential daily briefings. These guys had to make it like it was like Looney Tune comic books for President Trump to read a PDP. They had to deliberately make it visual and all this stuff. So what the hell? And does a president actually do and read the PDP every day? Carter did. President Carter did, but I don't think Trump did. So they had to sort of make it an entertaining briefing with lots of visual slides and stuff. So again, what does this mean? Reining in the bureaucracy. Okay, so they're all going to rein in the bureaucracy. The president should task the director with significant broadening recruitment, expediting onboarding practices, and shift resources away from headquarters, including terminal generalist GS-15s with OPM. In other words, they want to force out professional, high-level, GS-rated civil servants out of the CIA and put in their political appointees. The director should break the cabal of bureaucrats in D.C. by permanently moving various directorates out of Virginia and possibly open campuses out of D.C. where analysts and other experts could contribute virtually. Okay, I'm not against the public contributing. I listened to a guy who was in charge of the Freedom of Information Act CIA program a couple of months ago talk with Tim Neftali, who's a buddy of mine. And they were talking about the need to, quote, create openness with the civilian population. But, I wouldn't, we're not, and this isn't a Biden administration. I don't take them seriously in that because they're only talking about, I remember I went up to the guy and talked to him about something and he made some comment about, oh, well, I referred back to my colleague who was teaching at Columbia, who was in charge of the Russian program in the CIA. And I know the guy. And I said, so you really are not really interested in independent comments coming in to inform or add to your red teaming of what you do for analysis. And that was clear to me that he wasn't. So it's sort of interesting to listen to them give lip service to this in public, but in reality, they're not going to do that. Redirect resources. So certain CIA employees and offices have focused on promoting divisive ideological or cultural agendas and fostering a damaging culture of risk aversion and complacency. What the hell do they mean by that? Now, I tend to agree with this. The director should refocus the CIA to an OSS-like culture and mandate that all employees acquire additional or enhanced language skills, technical or cyber expertise, or field training to serve in overseas assignments. Yes, there's a general overall lack of foreign language capability in our whole population in general. That is as far as I'm concerned, a security threat to the United States. It just increases xenophobia and myopia on the part of the civilian population. And it's important for Americans down to elementary school level to be exposed to other foreign languages. There was a national security study about this very factor during the Carter administration, and it pointed out how we have declined. We're talking the Carter administration. We're talking about 1970s. You're talking about the decline of foreign language learning among the American populace. So this is sort of interesting. Now, covert action. Okay, so we can go into all sorts of problems. People will oppose covert action, in favor of covert action. They're talking about the need to, and what is covert action? The term covert action means any activity or activities of the state or U.S. government to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended the role of the U.S. government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly. Now, we know that this has gotten us into major wars. Covert operations, covert operations overthrew Mossadegh. Covert operations overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. Covert operations were used to manufacture the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. So covert operations carry great risk, and if uncontrolled, can get us into major wars, and do get us into major wars in the post-Cold War period. So this is always a question that a conservative president should identify individuals on the transition team familiar with the implementation of covert operation action with a view to place them in key NSC, CIA, ODNI, and DOD positions. And that is something all government, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans in power, they're all going to do the same thing. This is a question of, the president should demand creative thinking and clear strategies on how covert action fits within the president's broader foreign policy strategy. Any president who comes into power and understands the use of covert operations, they all adopt it. It's just nonsense. Every single president since Truman has adopted covert operations as a tool of American foreign policy, and even Obama, all of them do. Harris will do the same thing. So the question of what the covert action is being used for, what is its aim, what does it desire as a goal, that's what has to be questioned. Because, is it something totally anti-democratic? That's where you get into the politics of these things. Now, what do they do in terms of recommending changes? Here you get into this question of senior National Intelligence Service and officers. They should now here you get into this question of what they want to do in terms of civil service. They want to go into the CIA and the intelligence community and turn a lot of these jobs into political appointee jobs. Okay, this is furtherance of what they want to do in their changes here. The president preventing abuse of intelligence for partisan purposes. So that's a joke, because I could here they're complaining about. Now again, we could have a big fight about this. Trump-Russia collusion following the 2016 election, and the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop investigation, media revelations of his existence during the 2020 election. Now, I'm all in favor of equal opportunity investigations of these kind of things, but then the question becomes, here they're angry about, the question of intelligence being used that could attack them. I mean, his first impeachment was over the question of a whistleblower just basically leaking the fact that he was trying to pressure Zelensky to provide dirt on Biden. And that was the pretext of the first impeachment. Now, the question of, this is all, again, people have to read this. It gets into the weeds about the question of the CIA getting damaged, minimizing the Directorate of Operations, and exploiting the intelligence analysis as a political weapon after he left office. He's referring to John Brennan. And they're angry that John Brennan signed a letter that attacked Trump over his, quote, collusion with Russia, end quote. And again, people can have different opinions about that. Essentially here, they're talking about Here's an interesting one. The president should immediately revoke the security clearances of any former directors, deputy directors, or other intelligence officials who discuss their work in the press or on social media without prior clearance from the current director. So, in other words, if you're a former CIA director and you decide to oppose Trump, your security clearance is taken away from you, and things like that. And I think they've already done that. In fact, I think they did do that during the first Trump administration. They should use the Department of Justice to investigate leaks. So if you're a former DCI and you decide to oppose Trump, you're going to be investigated by the Department of Justice. And here they give, I find this sort of ludicrous. They want IC training should include stronger emphasis on the norm of political neutrality, including a mandatory course on professionalism at the National Intelligence University. Well, I believe, I know guys who teach at the National Intelligence University. I believe they actually include this as part of their basic kind of courses they do down there. And again, this is all this question of now FISA. Now, FISA is very important. FISA is the authorization that allows them to, violate the Fourth Amendment, for example. You take a FISA finding and you can use that. And I remember Morton Halpern, who, if people recall, was attacked by Kissinger in 1969 as the leak for the bombing of Cambodia. He was one of the people that he asked Nixon to have the FBI investigate Morton Halpern as a possible leak when he was on the National Security Council. Morton Halpern, years later, was involved in all this reform of the intelligence community. And Morton Halpern was involved in writing the FISA Act itself. I was actually a student of Morton Halpern's in the late 70s when he was actually involved in doing this. And a really interesting guy, brilliant guy. I don't even know where he is these days, but he was very involved in this. And the problem was,
Jim, I think the real leaker was Leslie Gelb, right, on Cambodia.
Actually, Gelb was a leaker, but they were investigating Halpern. They targeted Halpern and Anthony Lake, the Nixon administration, and they were actually looking at them. And Halpern was actually forced out. I think he resigned from the NSC at some point, but they were looking at those kind of guys as possible. Kissinger ordered that. All right. And that's something that, Halpern took personally because he had worked with Kissinger in the Department of Defense. Actually, he was teaching a class with Kissinger up at Harvard before he came back into the White House. So anyway, so here's this question of FISA authorization. And again, we're talking about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And when you want to go tap somebody, you need to get a authorization through the FISA courts to do this. So here they're talking about how to protect I don't know. In this case, they were angry that Trump campaign advisor Carter Page was surveilled under the FISA Act. But why? Because he was actually having collusion with Russian agents in Moscow. I mean, give me a break. So again, they're attacking that as, we have to make sure that doesn't happen, that these kind of political domestic intercepts are not used. So anyway, that's another thing. Now, again, they talk about China. Let's concentrate on China. What's the overarching conception of the adversary? Again, this is, subject for a whole series of different kind of talks to do. They talk about the Five Eyes relationship. The Five Eyes are Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and the UK. I think they talk about the cooperation intelligence-wise between those countries vis-a-vis China. And they're talking about the sharing of electronic intelligence and human intelligence. So the question here is, the emphasis on China is mainly in terms of coercive measures, military measures, less so on how do we get out of this? We now are back into a Cold War conflict with China, which I guess is what we're talking about here. And will this get back into a diplomatic relationship? they're talking about the discovery that China did a nuclear test of a hypersonic missile. And other questions about basically rallying the intelligence community to concern against China as a security threat. Again, to me, there has to be a diplomatic solution to this, not a military solution. Then the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. This is another part of the intelligence community. They basically want to amplify its authorities on counterintelligence and have it support, again, go after the Chinese. So here they're talking about the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. They're accusing them of stealing 400 billion to 600 billion in intellectual property each year. Now, there's no doubt that they do that, by the way. I'm not sure about these kind of estimates, but the Chinese are notorious for doing these kind of things. And in that level, I can understand these reactions. Because, look at what they did down with there was a big breakdown of the telephone systems in different parts of the country that they did all these cyber attacks. So they're talking about this particular area of the intelligence community has to be reinforced. Now, the question of analytical integrity. Again, I could point out the kind of, they're critiquing, they're doing a very partisan attack here on the Johnson and Bush administrations. And one could attack GOP administrations for the same kind of thing, basically not having integrity with analysis. This is a question of the RAND study of U.S. intelligence statecraft notes that the vast majority of intelligence analysts reside outside the CIA and do work that is tactical, operational, and current. And they go on to note the DIA is just as strong as the CIA, and the NSA is even bigger. Okay, so how do you have a balanced analytical focus? Because we know there's all these different, disparate interpretations of security. I mean, you're going to get now more. There's big divisions between the Department of Defense, the CIA, the State Department, and in the Department of Defense, there are divisions in the Department of Defense about estimating fighting against the DRV or the NLF. So these are not trivial terms. However, what do they mean by dissenting opinions? I mean, dissenting opinions can be the kind of things that were put forth in the late 70s when they had Team A, Team B talking about national arms control issues and nuclear strategy. And that basically reinforced those that didn't want to have arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. So again, these are interesting questions that are important to debate, and they raise the issue of the origin of COVID-19. I don't think there's any agreement on that one yet. And again, it's a reasonable thing to get down to what caused it. I totally agree with that as a necessity to find out. Although, do I think that China unwittingly wanted to release a pandemic to basically screw the whole world up? No. But again, these are serious issues that should be found out. An incoming conservative president will have the opportunity to signal demand for such strategic projects and prioritize their production through communications with intelligence leaders. In other words, let's synchronize what are the conservative president's assumptions and desires to have intelligence reinforce his presuppositions, because that's what it means in reality. And they can, disguise it with all the gobbledygook language they want. That's what they mean in reality. And of course, and some of these things are all common sense in terms of the writing of intelligence. Overclassification, I totally agree with that. There is an overclassification process that occurs. They talk about the need to change this and broader U.S. government intelligence community needs. They want to basically broaden this to Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security, and Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. They want to do more broader things. Again, I'm pretty familiar with reading NIE's national intelligence estimates over the past decades, and these are issues that are not neglected. Then cover in the digital age. How do you protect the identity of undercover internet intelligence officers? It's difficult in the digital age, and that's true. Privacy shield. The U.S. EU has tried to force U.S. companies operating in Europe to follow its data privacy regulation. The question of how do you negotiate data privacy is a very interesting one, and I would argue the EU is ahead of us on these issues. They're way ahead of us in cyber policy than what we've done. Now, the PDB, I mentioned that earlier. An incoming conservative president should make clear what the president's daily brief is or is not. It should be for the president specifically, with a much narrower distribution addressing areas of strategic concern. They're talking about rewriting the PDP and essentially, but that's important because that's the kind of information that the president gets every morning as to what are the, quote, international threats he should deal with. And then the National Intelligence Council is the IC's, the International Community's premier analytical organization. It has a dozen national intelligence officers, each of whom leads the international intelligence community's analysis within a region. And so they're talking about, should this be separate from the ODNI, and should it go back to the CIA? And then they talk about the intelligence. These are all these bureaucratic changes that have to do with interoperability. Technology issues are very important in intelligence. The question of the Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board, very important institution that I know guys who've actually been on the PIAB. Robert Jervis was on the PIAB, who was a deceased professor at Columbia. And, you know, he was one of these guys who was sitting there looking at all the NIEs. And so I do agree that you have to have a lot of smart individuals in there overseeing and looking at that. And again, whether it be right, left, center, who's in charge, these are institutions that would be in any kind of government in the United States. The problem would be, of course, the political objectives would be different. Now, the importance of space, expand with partners, space-related collection. And so I think we're at the end of this. So this was an overview of the discussion of the intelligence agencies. Any comments, any questions people have that they want to add about this? Go on, Alex.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I saw in this section that I guess you kind of didn't pick up on is I thought there appears to be an effort to centralize things under the DNI, under their plan, which again, it's more towards the beginning. Use the DNA as kind of to control the whole intelligence community, which again to that, and again with their whole, we're gonna insert political control. I say, I say good luck with that. Again, I think it's one area they'll almost definitely fail at all the, looking at what happened under the first Trump term. And also, the fact that, as was it, Chuck Schumer said, the intelligence community has 5 ways to Sunday to basically ruin the president's, day. So again, I see these as kind of, not wishes that they have, but I don't see them, having any more success doing any of these things. And, except in, little ways, obviously they will do a little bit of political control, but, the CIA and the rest of them, they have plenty of ways, through leaking, through, the kinds of things that they criticize in this document that, I just don't see a Trump administration doing any better than the first term in terms of controlling the intelligence community.
Well, that, of course, is what the whole purpose of the Project 2025 thing is, to basically not have that happen. Go on, Hal. What are you going to say?
I agree with Alex. I mean, the next part of that is the damage they'll do trying to do what they've set out to do, and then, I mean, the damage to the professional bureaucracies. The State Department was extraordinarily demoralized by the Trump administration. the intelligence community was extraordinarily demoralized by 9/11, not just because of the event, but because it basically all got blamed on the CIA, even though it wasn't really CIA's fault. I mean, there were warnings from the intelligence community about what was going to happen. So, I mean, tacking on to what Alex just said is, in their attempt to pursue these objectives, the damage they'll do to the professionals that are necessary.
Yeah, just let me ID what we're doing here. My name is Jim Dingman. You're listening to the session 3 of Project 2025. We've been talking about the portion of the study that deals with the State Department and the intelligence community. And we're going to, shift into what is actually the platform. But does anybody else want to comment on these issues with the intelligence community? Mike, you're unmuted. Do you want to comment on that, or John?
Yeah. I just wanted to point out the two things. I mean, there's two analytically separate but actually intertwined things that are going on here. One is the bureaucratic thing about just the rearranging of the bureaucracy, and the other is the attempt, in my view, that's not stated. In fact, they kind of formally say they're against it, but it's an attempt to impose an ideological imprint on the intelligence community. And that's the thing I think that is, I mean, they're already, despite the disappointments with Trump, there already is a ideological sort of imbalance, you might say, that's been going on for quite a while, for decades. But, this would really shift the balance, and it poses that potential.
Very true. And it's very funny. I have friends of mine who work in the Department of Defense, who work in the CIA, and I always, when I break their chops about this kind of stuff, their response to me was, "Well, Jim, wouldn't you rather have me in there than someone else who thinks like, they of course will refer to some MAGA kind of craziness." And I say, "Yeah, of course, but but I still break their chops." But these guys are rationalists. They're sort of realists when it comes to these kind of things. But you get these ideologues in there. You get a whole bunch of ideologues in there, and then you're going to have serious problems with intelligence estimates and framing, and how do you perceive threats. And again, I've been a keen student of intelligence failures all my life. I've studied them in detail, and everything that I have read through with you guys, I've read through this document now 3 times. This time was out loud, if you will. It reinforces what you're saying, Michael, because it just is. It's disturbing to think that they're consciously saying, "Hey, we want ideological conformity, and we want to have it in line with the president's agenda," which, again, we could say, is it in the national interest of the United States to then, have China perpetuate as an enemy? Is it in the interest of the United States to have Iran perpetuate as an enemy, et cetera, et cetera? And I just don't think that could skew intelligence, because you will be punished if you don't come out with an intelligence estimate or analysis that aligns itself with that kind of overall thinking. And that, I think, is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Iraq shows that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But Joan, you have a comment, or Carolyn?
I think they should get rid of the CIA. Isn't the CIA their own entity? Nobody knows what they're doing or what they're thinking or what's going on in there.
Okay, right on to that. Carolyn, you have a comment? All right. Let me move on to now. Remember what we saw last week. In the past week, we're at August 4th. So July 30th, the Trump campaign says, Project 2025 has nothing to do with us. And then, of course, we've had, ever since, I think the Times had an article. Let me show you that article. It's sort of amusing, because the Times basically had an article just a few days ago that basically countered all this. And and was pointing out that that in fact the Project 2025 is alive and well in the thinking of the GOP, even though they're saying that it isn't. And let's see, this is the article, Vance's links. Yeah, here it is. And this is regarding Vance basically making a comment and introducing the new book by Roberts. Here's Vance. This is an article that appeared on the 31st in the New York Times. And even while Trump is trying to distance himself from the Heritage Foundation, Project 25, his running mate's contribution to a new book by the project's principal architect is complicating his efforts. So there's a new book that Kevin Roberts came out with, Dawn's Early Light, where J.D. Vance writes the foreword. And in the fights that lay ahead, Vance writes, these ideas are an essential weapon. The introduction was obtained and published online by the New Republic a few days ago. Now, Vance announced in June that he'd written the foreword for Mr. Roberts, whose think tank became an influential bastion of conservative policymaking during Ronald Reagan's presidency. Remember, the first mandate study was done in 1980. It was 3,000 pages. It was 20 volumes. It basically 60% of its policy recommendations were implemented by Ronald Reagan in his first term. And here you see this question of providing a staffing pipeline for his administration. Now, just about a month ago, they had 12,000 people vetted. Now they have 20,000 people vetted. So whatever's going on, they're vetting people to actually become members of the bureaucracy and political appointees of a Trump administration if it gets elected. Now, here, of course, is the problem that this Vance endorsement happened, because Trump was seeing how politically it was screwing him up in the polls, and so he disavowed Project 2025 on the 30th. And a spokesman for Vance says the 2025, the forward, has nothing to do with Project 2025. Only President Trump will set the policy agenda for the next administration. And Trump wrote on the 5th of July that he knew nothing about Project 2025. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. A group in Fox, he said on Fox later that week, or last week actually, about in the past 10 days, a group of very, very conservative people, some of whose ambitions are absolutely ridiculous. So they're disavowing it, but nevertheless, Roberts basically presented Project 2025 as a direct response to the frustrations of Trump and his inner circle, to the resistance and legal roadblocks their agenda faced in some quarters of the federal government during his presidency. So, in any event, it's not unusual for a campaign to issue a whole series of policy prescriptions when they're running for office. It's not unusual in any American. The Democrats will do the same thing. Now, let's look at what they're actually talking about. This is the Agenda 47 part of the platform of the Republican Party. This is on the website of Donald Trump's campaign. Dedication to the forgotten men and women of America. They bring up the forgotten men. I think the forgotten men is a comment that FDR made during the Depression. The forgotten men, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I think this alludes to the description of people unemployed during the Depression, the use of forgotten men. But this, of course, is a theme that they're bringing. So here, I'm going to, some of this is, I'm going to go right to the policy prescriptions that they talk about. This is their sort of, okay. So what are our policy prescriptions? Defeat inflation and quickly bring down all prices. Seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. Build the greatest economy in the world in history. Bring back the American dream and make it affordable again for families, young people, and everyone. Protect American workers and farmers for unfair trade. Protect seniors. Cultivate great K-12 schools leading to great jobs and great lives for young people. Bring common sense to our government and renew the pillars of American civilization. Government of, by, and for the people. Return to peace through strength. That's interesting. That's right out of 1984. Now, here is the question of inflation. Now, this is again we're now getting into areas where the domestic policy think tanks in Washington have done a pretty good job in criticizing the latter parts of Project 2025. There's no doubt the inflation rate is high. However, and I was listening to somebody earlier today talk about how inflation has affected people under 30, and that's an important factor because when they talk about the student debt programs that have been initiated by the Biden administration, they tend to favor older millennials. Younger people under 30 are less reflected in those statistics. And I don't have to tell you, talk to anybody who's coming out of college in their 20s, they have a hard time ahead of them to find cheap apartments, etc. So the question, you cannot deny that inflation, and any of us go to the grocery stores, my God. I mean, but then who do you blame for that? Do you blame corporate greed? I blame corporate greed. I blame corporations for that. I don't blame, quote, either, Trump or Biden on that. I blame good old, capitalism in action. But, again, inflation is a reality, cannot be denied. Then unleash American energy. Now, that's a big, we will soon lift restrictions on American energy production and terminate the socialist Green New Deal. Now, that is a recipe, again, for, as far as I'm concerned, disaster, because we have to have some sort of common sense approach to global climate change. And I listened to, it's sort of funny. I listened once to, who's that guy at Columbia who backs the Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs, a couple of years ago, had a whole conference where basically he was frack away. I would say it was before Trump got elected. Frack away. Open up all the natural gas, resource of the United States. The hell with pollution issues. And that was the guy in charge of the Earth Institute. Now, and I remember if anybody criticized that in the conference, they were put down. They were looked on, they're basically ostracized by and that was in 2015 when that conference occurred. That was before the Trump campaign took off. But this is, again, an issue that is one of great controversy, and we'll talk about this as we go further into this. The whole question of how you deal with global climate change. Then reduced wasteful federal spending. Okay, so what's wasteful federal spending? Support for Medicare? Support for Medicaid? Support for, the Department of Education? Because they want to abolish the Department of Education. What is wasteful government spending? Reinstate his deregulation policies. That, of course, is quite controversial. You actually see studies on that, and it does not disproportionately harm low and middle income households. In reality, when you do fact checks on this, it basically reinforces the rich in our society. Then the question of illegal immigration. Again, a controversial hot button issue. We know that this is across both independents, Democrats, and Republicans. This is one of the reasons they hammer away at this. It always has high negativity rates in every type of polling data you do with every form of the electorate. Whether it be Democrats, Republicans, of course, more inclined to let's deport them, Democrats less so, but nevertheless, it hits all the different sections of the voting public. Restore peace through strength. Republicans will end the global chaos and restore peace through strength, reducing geopolitical risks and lowering commodity prices. I guess what this can mean lots of different things. It also means an increase in the Department of Defense budget. Seal the border. Okay, so we got this whole question of sealing the border, enforce immigration laws, begin the largest deportation program in American history. Now remember, this isn't Project 2025 we're talking about. This is on the website of President Trump right now. Okay. The U.S. will exist federal law to keep foreign Christian-hating communists, Marxists, and socialists out of America. Now, who the hell are foreign Christian-hating communists, Marxists, and socialists? We will use extreme vetting to ensure that jihadists and jihadist sympathizers are not admitted. Now, who is a jihadist and jihadi sympathizer? Is it some Afghani refugee who worked for the United States government in Afghanistan. They, like I know guys who were very much involved in trying to get their interpreters into the United States and face all these obstacles of people who basically sacrifice their lives for the United States, and then they're basically screwed by these kind of jingoistic measures, let alone the xenophobia and racism inherent in all this. But anyway, stop sanctuary cities. Another thing, I live in a sanctuary city, New York City. Many people do. I guess Los Angeles is a sanctuary city. So that's another controversial thing. Ensure our legal immigration system puts American workers first. That's another hot button issue. Remember, Trump made his idiotic comment in Chicago about black jobs. Immigrants are taking black jobs. And they asked him, what's a black job? Well, a black job is a job, Trump said. But, this kind of issue of inserting that into the debate. Build the greatest economy in history. Cut regulations. Trump tax cuts are permanent. No tax on dips. We've already analyzed. There's been objective analysis on the tax cuts, basically, again, skewed to help the ultra wealthy in our society. Fair and reciprocal trade deals, reliable, abundant, low-cost energy. Again, these sound great. They will simply, and they will include, booms up there in North Dakota, South Dakota, etc., in the areas where they frack. But then what's the trade-off of all this? Champion innovation, crypto, AI. Interesting, AI. He's got Musk supporting him. He's got Thiel supporting him. He's got all these people who have a serious investment in AI policy, giving him lots of money for his campaign. Democrats do too. But then what is AI going to mean for the economy? Expand freedom, prosperity, and safety in space. He wants to, continue his, let's send everybody out in outer space approach. Now, housing affordability. We know that this is a problem. It's a real problem. First, home ownership is difficult these days, particularly for younger people. And that's a legitimate criticism. But again, what does this mean? He also says the way to solve the whole thing is to increase the nuclear family. Again, how much is that ideological or not? Then accessible higher education. Well, we should have free public higher education, frankly, in our society. Affordable health care. Again, they're always angry over Obamacare because it was such a popular issue. And we know that the kind of prescriptions they make for quote reform in healthcare are going to make it worse for everybody. Lower everyday costs. Protect American workers and farmers from unfair trade. Okay, that also resonates in different areas around the country. Rebalance trade, secure street independence for China, save the American auto industry.
Wait there, Jim. I mean, that's absurd. Revoke China's most favored nations status. That's going to hurt American businesses in China a lot more.
Right. And that's a very good point you make, Alex.
That's just Looney Tunes.
Yeah, exactly. Every time they talk about this, it's always the objective retort is that this would indeed do what you're talking about, actually be counterproductive for American capitalism. Become the manufacturing superpower. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Sounds pretty good on words. Buy American, hire American. Bring home critical supply chains. This is, to me, like I said, interesting. How are they going to reverse? They want an autarkical economic strategy. Now, autarkical economic strategy, one of the lessons of the Second World War was not to create autarky, not to reinforce autarky, because that led to global war. And here they want to introduce policies that increase autarky. That was the strategy of the Third Reich in Japan that led them to invade Poland, and in the case of Japan, to initiate the attack on Pearl Harbor. Autarkical policies. So this is also a problem. Protect seniors. Okay, let's see what he's going to do with guys like us. Me. Protect
Deport us.
You what?
He's probably going to deport us.
Right,
kill us. One or the other.
Yeah, right. Well, a very good point, Joan. Now, strengthen Medicare. Now, we know that they want to cut Medicare support. I mean, so but this is smart on Trump's part. He knows that older voters tend to vote in higher percentages. So he wants to, I'm going to protect Social Security. Well, we know that the Republicans always are talking about turning Social Security into this big additional stock market thing that they want to play with. And where's Medicaid in all this? I mean, what about poor Americans? Protect care at home for elderly. Protect economic foundation for supporting seniors. This is all rhetoric. I'd like to see. This would be interesting. This is the kind of stuff that when we go into domestic policy, they really have good critiques about all these kind of measures in Project 2025. Now, cultivate great K through 12 schools, leading to great jobs and lives for young people. Yeah, I'm all in favor of good teachers. But what do they argue about? Ending teacher tenure, adopting merit pay. And now, basically, what they're talking about teacher tenure in the public school system is basically clobber the public service unions that exist. Republicans believe families should be empowered to choose the best education for their children. We support universal school choice. Oh, they're talking about voucher systems. Okay. And I'm a big supporter of the public school system in our country being strong. So this is, again, a tax on public school systems. Safe, secure, and drug-free schools. I'm all in favor of that. I think I don't see anybody disagreeing with that. Prepare students for jobs and career. Okay, what are the careers? We will expose politicized education models and fund proven career training programs. What do they mean by that? What do they mean by that? Restore parental rights. So now the parental rights issue is interesting because when you teach kids about slavery, they bring a big, that's against my parental right. I don't want my kid to learn about slavery. Knowledge and skills, not CRT and general indoctrination. This is all, again, crap. This is the kind of conservative BS we've been seeing. I laugh CRT. I remember the first time I ever read critical race theory was in the early 80s. And it was sort of a very boutique subdivision of critical legal theory. And it was very interesting to read. I read a whole bunch of journal articles. I read Kimberly Crenshaw, who I've actually had come and do teach-ins in Brooklyn for WBI Radio. Lovely woman. But this, again, is these ridiculous, no left-wing propaganda. Well, again, teaching about slavery as part of American history. It's nuts. It's absolutely ridiculous. And gender indoctrination? What are they talking about? What it is? Again, these are. I think about the attack. What
respect
what?
For LGBT, Q.
Yeah,
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, LGBT.
For non-binary students.
Yeah, right, and they're part of. And it's funny. I think about how many. I know conservative families who have LGBTQ relatives, and I know conservative families who had their sons and daughters die of AIDS, and they had to go through big transformations mentally to handle that, and they did. So lots of conservative Americans know gay people, and the whole thing is nuts. It really is. It's a hateful policy that is ridiculous. Sure, sometimes some of it can be a lot of BS, admittedly, but at the same time, gender indoctrination. We want women to be fully empowered to be as equal to men as men are to women, and this is all ridiculous nonsense. Now, civics education. What do they mean by that? Now, remember, they did that 1776 commission. I've read what they did in that report, and again, I'm a great believer in teaching American history. I'm a great believer in teaching about not only Western civilization. I think American kids in elementary school should be exposed to not only Western civilization, America's history, but also the history of other parts of the world. We should really renovate our elementary school and secondary school systems. But this is essentially a return to the kind of education that we had in the 1950s, really, when you look at it objectively. And and again, people just should read what they argue in the 1776 commission. It sort of amuses me because they always harp on Robert E. Lee. I actually admire Robert Lee as a general, but not as somebody who was a general defending slavery. That's essentially what he used his brilliance to do, to defend slavery. So again, this is, and critical thinking. What about again, it goes back to the national the national history standards debates of the early 90s, which I spent a year covering as a journalist, all these different fights. It was quite amazing. Or look at what happened in Texas when they had the big textbook controversy down there. I mean, you're talking about, let's go in and shape ideology and thinking in people. And here they're talking about, basically a fairyland attitude about American history, which is devoid of any kind of, confronting the complexities of it. How are you going to teach the Civil War if you don't teach about slavery? It's ridiculous. All right. Americans will champion the First Amendment right to pray and read the Bible in school. We have separation of church and state in our country. Again, I'm all in favor of people reading the Bible. I don't care. That's fine. I mean, but what about the separation of church and state? They want to eliminate that division. Return education to the states. We know that that's a big recipe for disaster, because then you leave it up to the state legislatures, and that's been a big fight for many years. Bring back sense to government, renew the pillars of American civilization. Again, what the hell does that mean? Restores law and order, cares for veterans, promotes beauty, and honors American history. Again, what's American history? Who's American history? Empower American families. Will promote a culture that values the sanctity of marriage. And what are they talking about? What's that science fiction novel about conform the what?
The Handmaid's Tale, I think that's probably your thing.
No, there's a science fiction novel that basically is very grim look at what happens when you can impose patriarchal societal notions of women's rights. And I just, it's slipping me right now. Rebuild our cities and restore law and order. We'll stamp the Marxist. Who's a Marxist prosecutor? I guess they're talking about what's his name in San Francisco.
Who was
Gilbert's son. Or not Gilbert's son, Bernardine Dorn and the other guy. But anyway, the son of them. But this is all ridiculous stuff. We will stand up to Marxist prosecutors, rigorously defend the right of every American to live in peace, and will compassionately address homelessness to restore order to our streets. Well, we look at what they just did compassionately with the Supreme Court with that SCOTUS decision on homelessness. Make Washington the most beautiful city in the world. Take care of veterans. Well, they always love to talk about that. We know that the Nixon administration, with all their defend the veterans thing, they actually screwed Vietnam era veterans in the GI Bill. And so that took Vietnam veterans in Congress and the Senate to change all that and create a GI Bill that was good for the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq and the forever wars. But that's an interesting question here. Take care of our veterans. They will fire radical left accreditors, drive down tuition costs, and pursue civil rights cases against schools that discriminate. Okay, so this is this whole thing of going after the universities, and we see it tied into questions of anti-Semitism, which we're going to see. We saw this all start to unfold in the spring with all these battles over the October 7th that occurred throughout the country. Honor American heroes, restore American beauty, overcome the crisis in liberal arts education. What is classic liberal arts education? Good. I mean, people have been fighting about the definition of that for decades. Males, Jim. True. Worship white males. That would be, and look, I'm all in favor of studying Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. I'm also in favor of studying Malcolm X. I'm also in favor of studying Frantz Fanon. I'm also in favor of studying Karl Marx. I'm in favor of studying Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. I'm in favor of studying Frederick Douglass. It's the whole thing. It's always mind-boggling when they make these kind of binaries. Now, government by and for the people. Stop the radical left Democrats' weaponization of government and its assault on American liberty. We will stop woke and weaponized government. We will hold accountable those who have misused the power of government to unjustly prosecute their political opponents. Now, of course, they're referring to Trump's trials in this. And every single trial, he deserves to be trialed for Mar-a-Lago. He deserves to be trialed in Georgia. He deserves to be trialed to serve trial in the immunity case in Washington. And all these things, he's beat his rap. And then, of course, you got the question of what happened in New York and he shouldn't have been allowed to run because he violated what amendment was that? The 14th Amendment. That whole case that occurred. So this is more foolishness. Dismantle censorship and protect freedom of speech. Defend religious liberty. I'm in favor of religious liberty. People should have the right to worship whatever the hell they want. I complete that to me, I totally agree with. However, they want to support a new federal task force on fighting anti-Christian bias. What the heck's anti-Christian bias? That's part of their drive for ideological conformity. We'll protect and defend the vote of the people on the issue of life. Here they got this whole thing they want to basically create as amendment, basically anti-abortion. That's not smart politically from the point of view of Republicans. We will end left-wing general insanity. Okay, we can get into big fights about gender and all that, but again, a waste of time. In election integrity. Okay, so here they get into this whole question of their attack on the electoral system integrity in 2020. And they just basically want to have an institutionalized form of basically denying the will of the people. That's because that's what you look at the outcome of all these cases, all their reforms are going throughout the United States. Their objective is to eliminate the will of people. Peace through strength. Modernize the military. Strengthen alliances. Okay, so this is all the usual stuff. Increase the defense policy. Increase the industrial base. If they get back in power, we're simply going to see an increase in the Department of Defense budget, similar to the Reagan administration. So, any comments on this before we close for today? And again, Agenda 47 is what they're talking about that they control, not Project 2025. It's very interesting. This is what we control, and we don't want Project 2025 to collide with our Agenda 47. That they consider legitimate, whereas Project 2025 is more nuanced, frankly, more intellectual in its approach, but in its outcome is essentially giving them intellectual legitimacy in their eyes to implement their policies. But any comments on any of this?
Yeah, I just want to check what you guys think about the fact that generally party platforms are put up there before an election and then they're discarded to the trash can afterwards. But you know, this sort of stuff in these times, it's unclear to me. I mean, to as to how serious to take these, and because there's some things I think that are really potentially would have serious negative impacts on this country, and but again, it's part of a party platform with with a presidential candidate who's a little bit wacko anyway. Just curious.
Yeah, good point, Mike. Do others have a response to that? Do they want to add to what Michael said?
Well, we're putting that into practice already. We're banning the books and what the Supreme Court is doing and all. Do people realize how scary this is? I mean, you'll give an AR rifle to a kid before he gets his birth certificate. A rifle for every time.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I would add to this, Michael, hold on, Mike, is that, you're right, these are sort of platforms. These have to be, we're talking about their ideas, their vision, if you will. And of course, the practicality of politics means that some of these things will just go out the door the way Project 2025 theoretically just went out the door for Trump because he saw that it was negative in terms of his popular support. And any of these kind of measures will go out the door if they look on they're going to weaken his ability to get elected. But the immigration issue, again, you look at the polling data for the past couple of years, that stays up high, real high. So they constantly hammer away at that. But you raise a very good point. And Joan, of course, is on point too, because, the question of they're already doing this with the books, with these, the culture war attacks, quite disturbing. Go on, Hal.
The whole question of, does anybody realize in 2016, 47% of the electorate didn't vote?
Another important point.
I mean, amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And I think those numbers got better in 2018 and 2020, because once the son of a bitch was in power, people who were grossly affected by it started realizing, oh, maybe I should vote. So, I mean, we'll have to see if Harris can get people out in 2024, but she shouldn't even have to. I mean, there should have been no reason for people not to vote in 2016. It should have been a slam dunk for Hillary. And I critique the Democratic Party on a lot of things about how they should be doing things, but I don't think there was anything else they needed to do in 2016. All you had to do is listen to a couple of Trump speeches. But 47% of the electorate didn't vote. Those are my students, by the way. My students don't vote, don't register, don't anything. In the state of Michigan, why did Michigan go Republican? Because the city of Detroit doesn't vote anymore. And it's not disenfranchisement. I mean, Detroit's not a Republican stronghold, it's a Democratic stronghold. There's nobody preventing poor black folk from voting in Detroit. But if the city votes, Michigan goes Democratic. When they don't, for nearly 40 years, it goes Republican. So, and how you solve that problem, I have no idea. It's like getting my students to read. No idea. No idea at all.
Go on, Alex.
Add to what I was saying again, there's that thing. I hope you guys have all seen it, the famous video of the speech by Paul 𝗦𝗀𝘀𝘀𝗶cie hy, where he talks about how Republicans don't want people to vote because I think he says our leverage goes up the fewer people vote. So that's been part of Republican politics for a long time. We all know about voter suppression, but also to give some criticism to the Democrats. I mean, in terms of why poor Americans don't vote is they've seen their lives, their economic lives destroyed by 40 years of both Democrat and Republican economic policies that have destroyed their jobs and things like austerity, tax. The fact that Democrats, whenever they get back in, they should be rolling back every single tax cut that the Republicans ever do, and then actually introducing new taxes, because that's when we don't tax and we borrow money instead, that's basically a gift to the rich and to corporations, because then the government, in order to make up the deficit, they borrow more money from those groups, and then they get interest that should be, again, taxes that we take out of them, because our tax level of taxation is so much less than it was even under John F. Kennedy or Eisenhower. And I mean, if you talk about the great wonder years of the golden age of capitalism in the 50s, that's because, in a large part, because of those tax policies back then that properly funded the government and gave the government plenty of money to intervene in the economy. But again, that's a bigger, longer term thing.
And many of my students would say, there's no difference between the parties. There's no difference between the candidates. And while I wouldn't disagree with what you say about Democrats basically becoming moderate Republicans, I would then say to my students, really? There was no difference between Clinton and Trump. There was no case of voting for the lesser of two evils, or in that case, the really great lesser of two evils. I mean, Hillary was no favorite of mine. I was very disappointed in Obama. But, I mean, there doesn't seem to be any ability to historically compare um, candidates, parties, policies. Just amazing. 28% of Hispanic Americans in 2016 voted for Trumpy Bear. Wild. Just wild. I mean, I guess they're assimilated. They think they're Americans, so they can vote for that party. But to me, it's just incredulous.
Well, I look back on when they started to actually pay attention to the lack of voting in national elections, which I believe the decline starts in 1960. I think the highest amount of participation, sort of, you could say that's the apex of the New Deal coalition that FDR constructed with Southern Democratic voters when he was able to woo black voters in the 1930s, etc., and then ethnic working class, lower middle class Americans. But then after that, you start to see a decline in the participation in national voting. Now, when I worked in a factory in 1971, 72, I used to talk to these guys. I was actually coming in there to organize in the factory. And I would ask these older workers, these guys were all World War II veterans, okay, why don't you vote? And their response to me was, they're all the same.
Yeah.
There's no difference. And again, these are people who were big supporters of Kennedy, who probably didn't like Lyndon Johnson because they felt that he had given to non-white people and black people with the Civil Rights Act, benefits that they themselves as working class white Americans couldn't get by vote. I mean, of course, these guys were not conscious of, or they weren't thinking about, all the questions that you could say about, well, they're white in our society, all the advantages, et cetera, that, we could go down a whole litany of things. But to them, it was like, here there are our competitors. What their responsibility all the time was, well, why should this guy get this kind of stuff? They felt that everybody was getting free handouts, stuff like that. This was pretty evident in the kind of responses I got in 1972 as the election was unfolding. I remember when Governor Wallace was shot in Maryland. I came walking into the shop, and I had a big grin on my face. I said, "Boy, these guys, when they assassinate guys, they don't know what to do. They don't have the right weapons." And all the black workers were like, "Yeah, right on." Everybody was like, slapping five. But the white workers were not too happy that Wallace got shot. And the whole Wallace movement thing is an amazing phenomenon of all that, the alienation, why people don't vote. And it gets right down to the fact that some people just say, the hell with it. It doesn't meet my needs. It doesn't serve my interests. Why should I pay attention to them? And it shows to me the alienation from our political system, which creates a kind of environment where you can have this phenomenon we're seeing right now of Trump being able to incorporate significant amounts of Americans. I think the average median income of a supporter of Donald Trump in 2016 was $80,000 a year. Now that's a, middle class income in American society. That is two families working hard to survive. And of course, they're ignoring the fact that there are people who don't make that joint income, maybe 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 in the poverty line, and they suffer. But that's where racism, I think, comes into play. Because then people will marginalize and discount the other out of their equation. But these are real serious issues as Americans we have to confront. And right now, and then, okay, you get this sort of, mamala kind of enthusiasm going on, with Biden being replaced. And I don't have to tell all of us, it's like a remarkable turn in the polling data. Yet, older Americans are still not necessarily, white males are not necessarily enthusiastic about Kamala. I mean, I'm going to vote for her. I'll vote for Kamala, but but nevertheless, white male voters are, and particularly non-college educated white male voters are in that alienated, and it's a question of alienation, and the alienation is understandable given many of these kind of questions. I mean, Alex was talking earlier, we were talking about deindustrialization. I don't think there were any sound policies in our country ever since deindustrialization got underway in the 1970s, with, hitting the Rust Belt pretty hard. I don't think there were really, and I don't live in the Rust Belt. I worked in a factory that went out of business when I was when I was going to college in the 1970s. They were forced out of Queens because the parent company, Kraftco, decided to shut down the factory in Queens because it was better economically to ship production in New Jersey. Now, remember, you look at all the decline of the steel industry in our country, which has been going on for many, many decades, is due to the fact that there is higher and more efficient steel produced elsewhere. The whole steel industry collapsed. And those were societies, if you live in the Midwest, you live in the Midwest, Hal. So, I don't have to tell you, look, you live where the auto industry collapsed. And so while these are Democratic strongholds, that I think it creates this alienation that is what we see manifested in the Trump movement. I think that's one factor that creates this whole. And I start with going back to the academic conferences I saw and studies I saw in the Tea Party movement when you had the recession in 2007, 2008, and then you had this incredible reaction to all that, which just is one strand into the Trump phenomenon. Go on, Al.
It's probably the primary factor, in fact. But I'm still, I guess, as an intellectual, still trying to figure out the rationality of it.
Yeah.
Because there's no rationality to it, and maybe it's based in emotionalism.
Yeah, very true. Mike, go on.
I just wanted to say that I think a good part of this kind of degeneration of the political system is because, or at least the conservativization, which is kind of related, but it's because currently the only real political culture is coming from the conservative side, where they have a base in evangelical churches, and there's this also a lot of other people just go along with the sloganeering, whereas I think the left has kind of not, back in the 60s and 70s, there was some degree of culture, a counterculture even,
right?
But that's disintegrated, and I think the real challenge is how you come up with a cultural rallying point, you might say, that people can identify with. I think, when it came to Clinton, I think she was a very poor candidate. I mean, she was obviously better as a person, and would have been better as a president than Trump. But as a candidate, I think she was horrible, and for various reasons. But one of them was, the attempt to, in my view, kind of focus on a sort of identity politics based on, gender, which I think created a backlash. And I think there needs to be a broader cultural, like back in the, when the unions were more powerful, that was a rallying point for, factories and, less workers. But that was cause for all these actions that have basically destroyed the unions in non-public endeavors. So I don't know. That's there does need to be some kind of a cultural rallying point, I think, that can reach out to these disaffected parts of the population.
Yeah,
I don't deny that. I don't deny that Democrats needed to do a better job with candidates. In fact, I thought they had learned the lesson with Obama of getting younger candidates to attract younger people, and then they go with the old war horses like Clinton and Biden. But then when it comes to election day, it's It's just the common sense of, okay, I don't like this candidate, but she's not a fucking nightmare. Whereas this other candidate is a nightmare.
Yeah.
And I mean, this doesn't take a PhD or an MBA to figure out. It's some commonsensical notion of what one candidate's going to do to the country versus another candidate. Maybe I'm looking at it too rationally, and it's all emotion. I don't know.
Well, isn't that the problem, that you never have somebody you want to vote for? You always vote because you don't want to get the other person in. I mean, I worked the election, and I can say where I work, it's never like where he says it's all this corruption and everything and all. But we're not, and the government doesn't do anything for you. That's the other thing. Once they get in, that's it. They don't care about you.
Yeah, Carolyn here on this, if I may. I see a whole lot of it through the eyes of my students. One of them very succinctly had this discussion in class, and one was very blunt. He said, well, I don't vote because I owe a lot of child support, and they'll find me if I'm on a voter registration list. The bureaucratization has worked not to his advantage. And a lot of people also vote because they don't understand things. I was fortunate enough, I remember when I was in, I think, 6th or 7th grade, my social studies teacher, remember them? She had us bring in once a week 2 cartoons from the opposing newspapers in my city, which happened to be in Newark, New Jersey. And she would select several pairs of those for discussion, explain what that political cartoon is all about, who looks that way and what's he trying to say and what's the issue. And so that was my political education that year, and it was very good. And I don't think students understand government, much less politics. They don't discuss it in a rational way. It's all about personalities, thanks to people like Trump. And then it becomes a question of morality, like Nixon and Clinton. So I think we have to go back to fundamentals and look at our educational system. It's why the attempt by the Republicans to, in fact, control education, destroy public education, and focus it ideologically is the problem. We don't have a good public education system, and if we ever started to pay mostly the women in education the way industry is now willing to pay, then we might have a better system. But we don't. So I'm going back to basics a lot on why people don't vote. Some of it is they just don't understand it. It's too complicated. It's very complicated. And you have to know something in order to figure out who you should vote for and why, and turn off the TV set for a few minutes or days or weeks and figure out what's going on. Our people are not doing that. They're not trained to do that. They're paid not to do that, in fact. They're paid to pay no attention to clip to the loudest voice, which can be purchased on commercials. And that's one of the issues we have.
Yeah.
Those are very good points. The question of perception is always very important. And, look, when you're trained, I was partially trained as a political scientist. So I had to take classes on American politics years ago. And I've been involved in, like all of us have been involved in campaigns throughout our adult lives. And I know that when it comes to foreign policy issues traditionally have been in off-year elections, unless we're involved in a war, have generally been issues that are not really followed carefully by the public. People are concerned about bread and butter issues. It's the economy, stupid, Carville's famous phrase. And another issue that I think should be put in the mix is many years ago, I was arguing with a program director at WBAI about doing shows on the fundamentalist Christian right. And my argument with him was, well, how many people have converted to Marxism-Leninism in the past 20 years as opposed to fundamentalist Christianity in America? Of course, it was a no-brainer answer to that one. And to me, and there was a colleague who had been raised in Ohio. He was actually the front. He was actually the receptionist for the station at the time. But he and I were always interested in doing shows that dealt with these kind of issues. And he was very interested, sort of stuff that Reverend. I liked it. I always enjoyed. I'm glad that we brought Reverend Barber. I mean, I may disagree with Mr. Henley about some issues, but Reverend Barber, of course, I've always been fascinated with as a figure, and I've also been fascinated with the fact that you need to have a left-wing critique or a liberal critique of fundamentalist Christianity to counter the kind of narrow-mindedness that these guys have fused their Christian nationalism with. And that's one aspect of this, because there's a lot that when you read these Project 2025 documents, some of these guys are ideologically involved as Christian nationalists. They openly talk about this. And that's another subphase of this to further investigate as one goes on. So I'm being certainly committed when we finish this Project 2025 stuff to further get into that. And then the whole question of false consciousness, which Marx raises. I mean, that's a legitimate issue. Now, a book like what Thomas Frank wrote about Kansas. You remember he did those books about, was it Who Studies Kansas? Someone might come up with a term. I interviewed him for television when he did the book.
What's Wrong with Kansas?
What's Wrong with Kansas? I interviewed him for television. And the first thing out of my mouth with him, I said, "Look, this Karl Marx argument." He said, "Yeah, of course. He knew what I was talking about. The whole question of false consciousness. Someone will adopt an ideology that's counter to their socioeconomic self-interest, and America is filled with examples of that. And certainly the MAGA movement is like, personified. And the issue of fear and the immigration issue is all. I mean, it's just amazing to me to see how these people react to this. You look in New York City, where you'll have. I actually witnessed in the subway system in New York City people attacking Asian Americans during the pandemic, and I got up and physically, I'm a big guy. So I got up and physically inserted myself into that to stop that kind of crap going on. But, you have these incidents where, people will manifest their fear by, oh my God, these people are bringing COVID into the country, this kind of stuff. Or the kind of aspects that, they apply to Hispanic Americans in other parts or undocumented people coming in other parts of the United States. Again, I've worked in situations, I'm sure all of us have. Those people who are from Southern California, like you, Michael, I've worked in situations in my life where the whole crew has been formed of undocumented people. And, who cared? These guys were just coming in to, support their families and send money home to, help their families back home, like any immigrant who comes to this country, And so to me, the xenophobia of it, but it's exacerbated by the decline in the past 50 to 60 years of good working class jobs, like the kind that existed in the auto industry in Michigan. All right. Which Hal would know, living in Michigan. Anybody who worked, UAW jobs were well-paying jobs. I once was in a union, which was a double-time union. One could make $40 an hour on double time. And this is about 10 years ago. That's a lot of money 10 years ago. And those kind of unions, they've been bargained away in negotiations with companies. They've been further diminished in the case of New York City by undocumented labor coming in and doing low-level construction jobs in New York, or setting up, company unions, which also exist. The mafia in New York did that in the carpenters union. They had set up a whole bunch of phony unions that could outmaneuver the quote legitimate carpenters locals. So, I mean, there's lots of stuff that happens in terms of these kind of things. And I'm not saying that organized crime is the main responsibility for this, because it isn't. But these kind of things lead, of course, to the lack of income for many Americans. We know that there's been a diminution of certain types of real income in American socioeconomic breakdowns of our society for the past couple of decades. And this is what manifests in this alienation we see. Ted, you haven't said anything. Do you want to jump in on this? Ted?
You're muted, Ted.
I just arrived. I came in late. I didn't realize that it started at 12:30. So I'm just listening at the end. I have nothing to add at this moment.
All right. Well, we're going to end it pretty soon. So you get your licks in, Guy. We were talking basically about, we went through the Project 2025 recommendations on the State Department and the intelligence community. And then we've been just basically talking about, I read through the Agenda 47. And so we're talking about, as you can see, we're talking about, why did people vote for Trump? I read through
the document. I read through the thing. I didn't obviously read every word of everything, but the whole approach here. I just heard recently, just earlier today, a report. I think it was on CNN. They were reporting on the comparison between the two rallies in Atlanta this last few days, the Trump rally versus the Harris rally. And the commentary was saying that the Trump rally was not only more enthusiastic and more vital than even the one that we've all seen on the Harris reporting, but there were long lines of people outside, and that there was clear evidence, according to this reporter on the CNN report, I think it was CNN report, that the Trump people are getting as many volunteers and extra signups in Georgia as were the Harris people, which is what this was not a particularly pro-Trump reporter, but it was just reporting on what they were seeing at that particular rally. So that's a theme that has to be remembered, that the enthusiasm in the support of the Harris's campaign, which is incredible, really extraordinary, considering what the situation is, has to be put against the realities of the Trump situation with the base mobilization there. So how do you do it? I heard President Trump's comments earlier today about how it was all of the Georgia governors, his own Republican Party's fault that situation was the way it was. So he's attacking his own party. But it seems party doesn't really matter to him anymore. Apparently doesn't even think about party. It's all about me, himself. And he's got a lot of people who, Heil Hitler, and off we go. They're following the Fuhrer. So I'm quite concerned that there may be an over enthusiasm about the penetration of arguments like the ones we presumably we're making about the article about the 2025 program. Now, there are horrible things in that, ghastly things in that. But now that the administration is attempting to, or the Trump people are trying to disassociate themselves from themselves and empty their own minds of their own ideas, it's pretty scary to think that we're going to have to try to sell the American public on the fact that they want to eliminate Social Security and et cetera, when in fact that's exactly what they want to do, and they've got the Supreme Court on their side. So it's not something that you can win in the next round of appeals after the next election. It may not go even as badly as they went in the last time. At least there, all the courts said no, thumbs down. But it's not at all clear that's going to be the case the next time the election's a challenge. That's my only reading on it at this moment. But I was reporting back this very strange moment that I heard that comparison between the two rallies, and of course I've heard nothing in all the networks and programs I listen to, and including the BBC, which is covering the Harris phenomenon extremely well. But now, of course, in England, they're all desperately worried about right-wing riots, which are deliberately targeting immigrants. And so why couldn't that happen here? Well, it certainly could happen here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me just share. Here's an article in the Washington Post yesterday that talks about the kind of preparation going on in both campaigns for the ground fight, if you will. And so here's these outside organizations that exist. This is a training program of Turning Point Action in Waukesha, Wisconsin. This is a outside group that is a turnout to vote operation. It's cooperating with the Trump campaign, and it takes advantage of the new lean-scenes in campaign finance laws. Remember, all the finance laws got completely thrown out the window with all those decisions in the past 15 years. And the GOP officials in battleground states have raised alarms about the scant presence of Trump campaign field staff. You obviously saw, this reporter in Atlanta obviously saw a big turnout down there. The Trump campaign had planned an extent. This is before takeover by Trump of the RNC in March. Uh, they wanted to basically, again, these are all calculations you make. These are strategies you make in designing political campaigns. They want to knock on 3 million doors and make 2.4 million phone calls in Pennsylvania. That's one hell of a turnout to vote in the state of Pennsylvania. In Arizona, they want to do the same thing and reach 558,000 voter contacts. But what they need to do is they've had to bring in all these outside groups to help them, because remember, they were having a crunch. And this is what's fascinating. We're only talking about 43,000 votes across Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin that were enough in 2020 to tip the Electoral College. So the margin is so close. And I know that the polls are showing that Trump's, I think they're coming down to more or less statistical equivalence between Harris and Trump. And so you're going to see the get out the vote campaigns really being the key things to turn everything around. They're talking about how these outside groups do the new financial laws. I guess they're talking about what's that decision that allowed everything to change financially, the Supreme Court decision. But anyway, the campaign outside groups are free to share messaging. So this is going on. They're pre-dividing themselves up based on their own focuses. So, again, Trump is getting a big reinforcement. And this is happening as we speak. Now, the question is the lesson they learned from 2020, because actually the Democrats outmaneuvered them in 2020. And they're talking about the campaign zone field operations using the same formula that Trump carried to victory in the Iowa caucuses under the banner of Trump Force 47. They're basically collecting volunteers all over the place. And Trump Force 47 prioritizes many volunteers doing a few impact tasks instead of old models. The question of how you use social media is interesting in all this too, because we know that Obama, for example, innovated in his fundraising techniques the use of the internet. So how they're going to use social media right now, TikTok, all these other things. But the Harris campaign is essentially rolling out with 1,300 staff members, 250 offices. They have all those volunteers who signed up since Harris announced. So they got all these people to go knock on doors in all the battleground states. They want to have personal contact. Now, I know, having done this, personal voter contact way exceeds making phone calls. You want to really get in someone, talk to somebody, have a half-hour conversation with them, and you want to knock on doors. That really works. But the conservatives are in the counterattack mode too, so we'll see what happens. So this is an article today in the Washington Post, yesterday, about all this, and they talk about all these other organizations that are coordinating with Trump. America First Works, Turning Point Action, etc. Now, a group to sort of pay attention to, this guy, David Hogg, Hogg, who's running a Gen Z operation to get out the vote. Very interesting to look at what he talks about in terms of younger voters. I think wasn't Hogg one of the people down there in Florida?
Yeah, he's one of the victims of the school shooting.
The school shooting, right. Yeah. Now, and he's a very smart young man. He's talking about Gen Z's approach. They're supporting some 24-year-old who's running in, I think, Arizona or someplace like that. He's running for the House or the Senate, but they're supporting an Indian American. Oh no, in Georgia. Excuse me, an Indian American running in Georgia, who's a 24-year-old graduate of, I think, Georgia Tech or something like that. But the guy's being supported by them as a Gen Z candidate, and I'm all in favor of Gen Z. I mean, I'm a big enthusiast of guys like me, transferring my broadcast journalism skills to young guys, so they can replace us and allow us to, go into the sunset and relax. In any event, so if anybody else want to make a final comment before I close out today?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go on, Mike.
I just couldn't resist throwing this out. It kind of reinforces what I think was Carolyn was saying, but I teach political science at a community college, and now primarily online, but when I was in classes, what I would always do would be to start out the first day by having kind of just a mini quiz on what people knew, stuff like what are the three, branches of government, what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans. And I just noticed as a result of this that what's going on. I don't know what's going on in high school, but the civics knowledge and experience that people have, that a large proportion of people in these classes had, was non-existent. And
Absolutely.
pardon?
I said absolutely.
Yeah, and I know that there used to be, at least when I was in high school, civics was taught pretty well. So I just don't know what's going on with that. I think it may be a result of the sort of devaluation of public education nowadays. And but that is a genuine result. And now with the Republican platform and the Project 2025, and its talk about what they want to do in colleges. That's it seems to me that that's an attempt to extend the situation.
Yeah, very true. And I know in the state of New York, just let me finish this comment. State of New York, they took away in the past 50 years in the secondary school system a year of social studies teaching. It was because I used to, and when I was in junior high school in New York City, I used to have to take in 7th grade and 8th grade each year a social studies class. They removed that in the past 50 years. And I think all of us here, some people with have great experience teaching in community college. I know Alex and certainly Carolyn. Hal is in charge of it. He teaches at community college right now. And Ted, of course, has taught in the state system in New Jersey. But you saw this in everything. I remember I would go in and substitute teach in a community college in Queens, and I would teach political science classes, intro political science classes. And I would ask all the kids to tell me what they think political power was. I'd ask every person individually in that class of 80 what they thought political power was. And boy, would I get some answers. But, because I would just basically want to break the wall between me and them. And, it was amazing to listen to, because you're right about that. I mean, but it's not to say that people don't want to learn that, because they do. Right. I found that to be the case. If you have to, I felt that all the kids in the class were hungry to learn that, and they wanted to be treated in a sophisticated fashion. They didn't want to be, sort of treated as children intellectually. I mean, they wanted it to be rigorous, and they enjoyed that. But I think you're right about that. There's a national breakdown about teaching basic civics in the secondary school system that has been going on now for 50 to 60 years, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Alex.
Yeah, I want to bring up two words that we haven't been using, which imperialism and militarism, that I think in part explain Trump, but also explain our general predicament here in the United States. And, my general conviction that, we're going to have to kind of, on that level, we're going to have to wait for which we're seeing the collapse of the American empire before our eyes. And, I think we'll have to wait and see, the emergence of a multipolar world, probably with China as, replacing us as the most powerful country on the planet, whatever that's going to mean for, how things are the next 20, 30 years. But I think that's something, I think militarism has been a particular force kind of, propelling some of these underlying issues.
How many people are now rushing out to learn Chinese?
That too, Ted, yeah, good point there. We all should.
Well, the issue of militarism is an interesting question, Alex, because it's clear that you look at someone like Trump, the way he uses militarism is quite bizarre in some ways, because here's a guy who, when he's in, I mean, I always go back to when he's in Paris with Kelly, with General Kelly as his aide. And for Donald Trump, it's too rainy a day to go out to Belle Isle Wood and honor the Marine dead out there. It's just, and then supposedly, if he said these things to, to his aides, which he's denied, of course, that, you guys are suckers for, I mean, all this kind of stuff he came out with, that we know, this whole litany of comments he's made over the past, 5 to 6 to 7 years. It always amazes me. And he's just gotten away with murder, really, to get away with this and then not be held account for it. But an amazing phenomenon. He loves to surround himself. That's always when I would criticize the left. They let it was very interesting. Many years ago, when people were in Paris talking to Madame Bin, she was on the negotiations for the National Liberation Front. She was part of the Vietnamese contingent in Paris. She criticized them for letting the right wing take control of the flag. And someone who both Alex and I know, I see Ted's dropped off. One day, Al Nofi and I are walking down Madison Avenue. We bump into the guy who is going to the Supreme Court that week, who was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party who had burned the American flag. It was a famous case where he won the right to burn the American flag as a statement of political expression. And we had a big argument about that. I said, look, why bother with the American flag? We know it alienates a lot of people. What are you doing? And because I always felt that was the wrong thing to do. I always felt like taking the American flag. But again, one respects the fact that that's a form of political expression. But Madame Bin said, why do you guys allow the right wing to take control of the American flag? Why do you not use that politically against them, against your foes? And she's right. And I know that in anti-war, and I know in anti-war groups I've been in, certainly VVAW, everybody felt like, this is ridiculous. You take the flag and seize it and control it. You don't let the right wing define the use of it. So in any event, that I think is something, the question of what is patriotism? What is America? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a patriotic American? To me, it means a patriotic American does not mean wanting to throw freshly arrived immigrants, across the Rio Grande into the drink. I mean, that to me, that's anti-American, frankly, and against any notion of what I consider to be an American. And I'll play who's a greater American with anybody on the street. Okay, that game to me is just, I'll play that in a heartbeat with somebody who wants to throw that at me, because my family goes back to the Revolutionary War. So I'm not going to play that game with somebody. Somebody wants to play that kind of bullshit game with me, I'll pick up that gauntlet and run with it. I just think we have to have a America that is, we're all descendants of immigrants, including the people who want to cross the Bering Straits in some ways, if you look at it objectively, from Alaska, from Siberia, Native Americans. But Native Americans, of course, are here before anybody else. And, it's just to me, let's move to a better, let's move to a vision of humanity that is really encompassing everybody, all humanity, not just different parts of humanity. And, to me, that's frankly, where we should go as a society. But, that's just me. Anyway, does any, I see, Daryl, we've been talking for about 3 hours and you're coming in here at the last minute. But what we've been talking about, Daryl.
I love you.
I know. We're ending our discussion, and I certainly let you jump in and express yourself. We've been talking about the whole question of why people support Trump, question of racism, xenophobia in American, the body politic, etc. And, you're more than free to wax poetic on that as we go out, because we're recording this. We're going to post it and repeat this on Tuesday with a further look at Project 2025. But Daryl, please express what you'd like to share. You have to mute, Daryl. I know you're not one to be shy to talk.
Yeah. No, it's my phone. It's me more than anything. Okay. Folks, family first in Bronx, New York. First of all, Jim, I want to thank you for this. People need to have talk. about how manipulation works, and the most stress point, they will go for almost anything to avoid being responsible where they are and then correcting the situation. So I was listening to you talking, defining patriotism, and especially the flag. And I
Daryl,
You're breaking up,
I
Daryl.
was looking at. I am okay. Let me look. Is this any better?
A little
yes.
better. You still have a backbeat coming in there, but go on.
Let me move some more. All right. So bottom line is that people who need to separate the
Now you went. Yeah, go on.
there was an announcement about the recording in progress. From how they define where it is they live and what it is they want to do about the place that they live. And so I would suggest that that once the individual understands what they want for themselves, then the question is do you want that for everybody else? Or are you only interested in promoting oneself? And then you can have questions beyond that. So if I'm giving up my sovereignty so that you can be independently wealthy and I can work in the field for the rest of my life and have all my children's labor assigned to your family in perpetuity, I don't think it's a great deal. So I'm not tossing my sovereignty in on that game. Well, what's the reaction going to be? The reaction is going to be the person who wants me to do that will then take more than likely some kind of physical action to force me to work for them for nothing. And I think if we look at it from that point of view, that the only thing that I've seen is universal on this plane is your labor and how you manage your labor and what you decide to produce with your labor. And then what happens with that product, whatever it happens to be. And other than that, what is there?
All right.
Can I add something to what I started to say?
Yeah, go on, Carolyn.
Daryl's statement reminded me. Before I think you came on, Daryl, I talked about how education has changed, and I jokingly, and I was told never to say this jokingly or otherwise, I'm blaming women's liberation for the decline of public education in the United States. I had women teachers who, in this day and age, would be CEOs somewhere. They were very good, very smart, well organized. They knew what they were doing. If we really want to look at the beginning and talk about grassroots efforts, the next time a vote comes around to raise the salaries of public school teachers, make sure you vote and get a lot of other people too. The quality of education cannot be determined by poverty. People going into education are resigning themselves to a very limited income for the most part. And I think that society has to look carefully at what we're doing. Minimum wage is one thing. Teachers should not be getting minimum wage. There should be a lot of competition for very highly paid jobs. And I think that if we look, bloom where you were planted, I think is what I'm thinking about. One of the issues that we're discussing had a very early start, and it has to do with how we allocate finances in a society. Taxes are one thing, but taxes for education are quite up for grabs. And I think the Republicans see that. They want private schools, they want religious education, they want to control the books, the teachers, the subject, the curriculum. And I'm saying, let's just keep public education very public and very well paid. Just a thought.
All right.
Ted, can I joining Carolyn made an excellent point there. It reminded me when I heard Vice President Harris address the AFT just a few days ago, and she threw away what's almost become a regular exit line. We really have to improve the pay of teachers. You don't get paid as much, but the reality is that's not a key activity of most politicians in America, is to improve teachers' salaries. I know because I taught at William Patterson University, former William Patterson State Teachers College, where I used to have like 1/4 or 1/5 of all the school teachers in northern New Jersey used to be graduates of my college when I went there 30 years ago, and the salary ratio hasn't improved very much since 30 years ago. So I think that this has been a problem that the Democratic parties in states like New Jersey, which are heavily democratically dominated, well, he did have a couple of Republican governors in there, but generally the assemblies have been dominated by Democrats, never made that a key issue, often largely in large part because of the local control of school systems. So the schools didn't want to pay the towns didn't want to pay the taxes necessary to pay the teachers as much as they needed to be to attract. It's not a question of attracting the best people. It's just rewarding the people long enough to be able to stay in the occupation and stay in the occupation and teach against all the other social factors that have fallen on teachers on the side. If teachers are responsible for the entire social welfare of the society and parenting, plus drug control, plus now truancy is an issue that came up raised against Harris, for example, in California, that she was going to send all these parents to jail because their kids weren't in school, which was not at all the truth about what she had done in San Francisco. Those kind of issues are all falling on teachers, and so it's not just what they don't teach civics. Excuse me. It's not that they just don't teach civics. It's that the entire system of the society is now falling on teachers, and as Carolyn said, they're not being paid well. Thank you.
Go on, Al.
Before we do anything, we need to re-employ this deindustrialized working class, because until that's done, no one will care about the pay of teachers. No one cares anyway. Teachers and professors, I think, are about as hated as journalists and lawyers in American society for a whole series of reasons. But if you don't re-employ that deindustrialized working class, they're going to turn into fucking nightmares, and all the education in the world won't matter. All right, we are financial animals as Americans. I mean, it's about the material lifestyle that we develop for ourselves, and if people are denied that for whatever reason or reasons, there's the mob. There's 6th January.
Yeah, good points. Go on, Daryl.
And how you reemploy those folks, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's the problem. Without education, how are they going to learn the past skills? So if industrialists aren't prepared to create systems of taking workers from school and then educating them in their own system, then it's not going to happen. And that's, of course, what many other countries in the world have done. And people talk that way every once in a while. And you get people, but you've got other people now saying you don't need the people at all. You just use AI, right? Who needs people?
Right. That's a big problem. And then, of course, the other issue when they talk, before I bring Daryl in, you go back to the arguments about deindustrialization policies. They were talking about the necessity to make community colleges free. That was one issue that I remember from the literature in the 80s. And I don't know if community colleges became free around the United States. I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, go on, Daryl.
No, I was just agreeing with you. They're not. Go ahead, finish.
No. Just, it's funny. Both Alex and I know we were in someone's apartment who died recently, who had a huge collection of books. He would run the Revolution part of the Marxist Education Project. So I went nuts and I got a ton of books out of there. I know Alex did too. And one of the books he had there was a 1990 study on deindustrialization, which I remember I bought, I hadn't read, and I said, let me pick this up. But the deindustrialization issue is a very important one. And and the whole question of AI. Look at what was that Chinese American who was running for president, who had that whole guaranteed income strategy, and part of that was
From New York, right?
Yeah, the guy from New York, and the part of it was due to the fact that they were predicting how AI would basically permanently eliminate certain types of jobs in the working class, which is probably going to happen. And we're in the middle of going through that revolution right now. So then what's going to happen? What's that going to, how's that going to relate to these kind of discussions in Project 2025, which essentially want to demobilize the power of a government to handle these kind of social justice issues? Anyway, go on, Daryl.
Okay, so the first thing that I would suggest is that we get off of Democrat, Republican, because none of those definitions, as I grew up, are anywhere relevant to where the positions of those organizations are right now. Two, that rather than, and it was interesting, on the TED Talk today, they had a woman on who does research at MIT, doing a critical analysis of people who download AI to perpetuate a being that was on this planet that they had a relationship with to continue the relationship. And why do I bring that up? Because why not take the tools that have been designed to remove the burden and use them for removing the burden? And then let's look at it this way. Right now, is there sufficient capital earned on the planet to feed every person on the planet, clothe every person on the planet, feed every person on the planet, and educate everybody on the planet? Yes. You go through the first 7 Americans on the Forbes real-time, their net worth is $1 trillion. 7 people, $1 trillion. Figure it out, folks. Something isn't happening here for the rest of us, right? So there's them who control the capital. Then there's those who produce the capital, who are compensated highly for the skills that they've developed. And then it trickles on down. So you've got a whole set of folks who are literally dying to learn something to benefit their community, and then put their communities on the road to wherever their communities want to go, by 7 individuals who, because of how we choose to exchange goods and services, make the decisions. Now, you can elect all you want. You can go to the...
You're breaking up, Daryl. You broke up, man. But I hear what you're saying. The question of, the extreme wealth in our society, super wealth. Because for some reason we lost your audio.
And organize the capital in a way that is efficient. He can decide who starves and who prevails. Who's monitoring if it is true that Bill Gates owns most of the farm land in the United States of America? Who's monitoring that? Who can monitor that? Who needs to monitor that? Right? There are all kinds of things that we go in on the back end accepting premises that are totally invalid for the situation that we're putting them on. And so, I watch my nephew. I don't watch him. I listen to him talk to his chat box, and he pumps out all kinds of different programs and things in minutes that used to take him days to do. Now, how does that affect? Well, if that's going to cost 19 jobs, well, screw that. You got the money to feed, clothe, and house everybody right now. Why not free up some brains to come up with different ways of doing things, rather than keeping everybody in terror as to whether this is the 19th century and we're going to come out of the coal mine alive so that we can eat some gruel? I mean, come on.
Right.
Folks, I'm going to shut up.
No, you're right, man. You're right.
But it can be more.
250 cents a the deal is that you have the technology right now. Yeah. Even if you want to use quote unquote technology. I was watching something on PBS about the brain gut connection, right? So it's the microbiome of the intestines and feeding the energy to the brain. And people look at that stuff, and as our current interim manager would say, yeah, but there's the real world. Cancel that. There's nothing real about this experience. And that's a hard pop to bite. But you are the creator of this. You know, we have Donald Trump because folks believe that he is the way. They had, I can't believe I'm even saying this. They had Adolf Hitler because they believed he.
Oh, you hit the button there, Daryl. We lost you on the Adolf Hitler thing. Go on.
We don't have to take any responsibility. We'll let Hitler read what is that stuff that came out of the late 1800s in the United States that then developed into the stuff that the nurse. Oh, it's so good to have a brain that you can work with. Eugenics.
Oh, right. Yeah, eugenics, right.
Okay, so why, if I was a German, I'd be totally offended at someone coming at me talking about how concentration camps were offensive when you had annihilation camps for the indigenous people, and then you took their children anyway. I mean, help me understand any of this. I'm just a poor country boy who went to city college and couldn't crack it. And what I'm saying to you is, let's not think the way we've been taught to use the knowledge that's available. Let's first of all understand that you have a population in which, out of the 330 million people, you got a good 200 who don't have a clue that they're on the planet Earth and what that means. So why don't we start with teaching people things that they can use in their day-to-day life that will make their lives better, rather than crying about how do you live in a city of 100 billion people? I'm sorry, 100 million, no, not 100 million, 100 billionaires, and then have the mayor of that city talking about we have to cut the budget to the libraries because we don't have enough money. If they have made $1 billion, one would think that they could come up with something on their own, especially since one of them was a mayor of the city. What is the housing crisis about? Is that we're unable to build housing? Is it that we're unable to feed people? Are we unable to educate people? No. It's about keeping people who are in power in power. So this is a jobs program. So how do you want to participate in the jobs program as it's currently laid out? And we'll use the electoral system as a cover to make people feel like they're really participating. I'm staying currently in a community co-op city, Northeast Bronx. It is the largest cooperative in the world. And the first person who figures out how rich this place is, I'm sure some hedge fund has got this place all spied out. They had an election, 15,000 families. They needed 5,000 votes. It took them 3 times. They had to extend the vote 3 times. Yet if you ask the average individual in here, oh, my maintenance is too high, it's the lowest in the Bronx, right? It isn't about what is, it's about what we want to be and what we're willing to do to get what we want, as compared to, what was the Texas legislator who worked for about 7 years to redistrict Texas so that it became a permanently Republican state, and then took all the Dixiecrats and moved them into the Republican Party, and everything is going great. No problem. We have to make the determination. Forget everybody else. I don't want to hear anything about anything. I want to listen to someone who will enable me to take my mind, organize it, and then be good to 150 straight out. 150? What are you talking about? People can't even make 70. Why? The technology's here. And then when I say about technology, I'm talking about the healing presence, or whatever you want to call it, is here right now so that everybody can be absolutely sane. Now, wouldn't that be interesting? What would this world be like if everybody made decisions in their own interest and in the context of the interest of their neighbors, as tribes are meant to be?
But that's the whole rub.
Death.
That's the whole rub. I mean,
yeah, I'm with you, Hal.
In 2001, when W and Company came into power and decided to do tax cuts, a repeat of the Ronnie Reagan tax cuts, 100 of the richest Americans, or maybe it was 200, Bill Gates included, and I'm no defender of Bill Gates, but they signed a petition to Congress saying, don't pass these laws. Don't pass these tax cuts. We don't need them. Our descendants don't need them. Other Americans do. Congress still passed the tax cuts because they knew if they didn't, they get all kinds of phone calls, emails, and letters from the bottom 99% saying, why didn't you pass those tax cuts? So I don't think it's entirely, those 7 individuals. I don't think they're necessarily in control. I think this is an ideology that's taken hold at all kinds of levels and all kinds of sectors of American society, and is driving a lot of this. It's very complicated. I mean, why people vote against their own interests or don't vote. Very complicated. I've been trying to figure it out for years.
Yeah, that's what spurred this discussion, Daryl. We were actually going to end about 40 minutes ago, and then we started to get into this discussion about this, which is, in fact, a very, very important and interesting discussion.
Well, once again, I'm going in. I've been on both sides of the mental health issue, both a recipient of really poor treatment and a recipient of excellent treatment, and the difference, both quantitatively and financially. The crap that they put out here as quote unquote mental health. Oh, did you get in a treatment program? Oh yeah, man, I got in a treatment program. And you listen to what they're saying. They're saying the same stuff that allopathic medicine says to cancer. Oh, you got diabetes. You're gonna have to take this medication for the rest of your life, and maybe we can exercise you a little bit and get you to that store that you go to every day that's got 90,000 things that are gonna kill you and 10 things that are gonna make you healthy. Come on, stop. This is a jobs program, right? Al, what you were talking about is the perfect jobs program. Those people wanted to keep their jobs. That's why they passed that tax cut. Because who's going to give me the money that I need to run next time? And then where am I going to get the money to manage all these other LLCs I got going on that are all dependent on me having a job?
Yes, they wanted to get reelected. They weren't voting a policy from those 100 top Americans, though. They were voting from John and Jane Q. Schmuck.
Yes. And now how do I reach John and Q. Schmuck? Right? What has John and Q. Schmuck been taught their whole lives? If I do it the way I'm told and I'm loyal to the company, I'm going to be rewarded. That's what I grew up under.
Well, I think in this case, loyal to the political ideology.
Yeah, okay. And so they shifted it a little bit to make it the political, because the companies weren't loyal to anybody. You couldn't even depend on them to take the money that you wanted to give them to ensure that you had the job.
If you're right, it gets back to my point that we better reindustrialize the country and find jobs for these folks. Otherwise, they're going to turn into the mob if they're not already.
Actually, I think that once you show people that there are tools that can be used to increase their mental capacity and agility, and that you can replace that gut emotion to that it is quite normal that I'm going to starve in this society unless I look out for myself because no one's going to look out for me. Well, we need to invent a way that this conglomeration of people who come from different areas of the world can demonstrate what they keep talking about all the time, which is demonstrate that they do actually care about one another. Now, the potential is clearly there. However, the need of the populace to fulfill the educational indoctrination of we need to become the government that we're looking for. And that then would require the population to take responsibility. If you notice, they talk about government like it's some outside entity, just like people talk about unions as if they're not it. You're it. You have to be responsible, right? If you elect a shop steward and the shop steward's corrupt, then you have to take on that corruption. And if that's going to make you uncomfortable, so be it.
Not uncomfortable.
Way.
Big question mark. Good luck on how to do that one.
I know.
I've been trying that for 30 years in a community college classroom. No more successful than before I started. I'm going to sign off before I hang myself.
Go on, Carolyn.
Yeah, this is more or less.
Think of at least 4 students that you know of whose lives, who because of your introduction of theory, have been able to change their lives. I mean, I understand that it's challenging to be in the fields and seeing zero crop year after year, but that's because your backup isn't there, and they keep cutting you off when you begin to make progress. Especially if you're teaching at a community college. I mean, you get the folks started into looking into the whole thing to begin with. But I will be quiet again.
Yeah, go on, Carolyn. You'll have the last word. Go on, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. This is another community. I got into community college at the start of the movement, and it was, I thought, a very altruistic ideal, college for people who couldn't afford universities. And someone pointed out, no, it was at the right time to keep veterans from picking up their guns and shooting up somebody because they couldn't get jobs. It was meant to accommodate people returning from the war in the 60s who had no other place to go. And sure enough, some of those veterans ended up in my classroom. And they would sit in the back and watch the kids, as I call them, everybody under 30, act up in class, and they were very helpful, sort of a shut up and let her teach kind of help, but they knew a good deal when they had it. And the community college movement blossomed into such a success that more of our students were transferring to four-year colleges than the law required or allowed. And they said, oh no, you can't let them do that. Get them out and get them jobs. It's just here to give people jobs, and just keep the nurses aid program going and let them find jobs, but don't be transferring so many. Well, it was a big to do. And what is the function of the community college? Well, the students knew what it was. It was to educate them and get them out. And they did it very well. So I think a little opportunity goes a long way, and I think that's one of the things we need to look at. I'm beginning to really focus on the basics, like elementary school education.
Yeah.
And we need to focus on that. And and the kids will take care of themselves if they have it.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing about this rejuvenation of the Democratic Party campaign. I mean, look, I'm not one in Pacifica who thinks the Democratic Party's trying to take us over. What the hell are they going to take us over for? What is there to take over? I'm all in favor of, I'm not going to vote for Republicans. I mean, I once voted for a liberal Republican once in my life, and that was it. because I felt he was the best choice of a bunch of bad choices. But generally, I'm going to vote for a Democrat or a third party candidate. And in this race, I'm glad that Kamala Harris has emerged as the front runner. I mean, I think this is going to be very exciting to see. And I don't want Trump in the White House, period. End of story. Don't want to see that happen. But these kind of issues we've been talking about are very interesting. The whole question of education. And I'd sort of curious to see, next time we do this, which will be on Tuesday at 9:30 at night, I'll throw up I'd like to look at the Democratic Party platform too and see what they're talking about. Although we're still going to be dealing with foreign policy for the next session because it deals with the Agency of International Development and also the basically the international communications devices and apparatus of the United States government and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That'll be also part of what happens. But in any event, listen, let me thank everybody for coming today. It was a lot of fun. Enjoyed it. I'm going to turn it into a podcast. It'll get posted. I'm going to send it off to the people on the West Coast. They'll edit the hell out of it. So it'll be played at some point in the Pacifica system. Will be on an audio port. Otis is putting on audio port so people can use it. And you guys, thank you so much for participating. I guess tonight I'm going to may or may not do the town hall tonight. I just wanted to sort of catch up with the latest kind of financial stuff going on in the network. What you've been listening to is a Project 2025 study group presentation. This is the third session we've been doing. The next session will be on August 6th at 9:30. That'll deal with the Agency of International Development and also the international communications agencies of the federal government, the CPB, et cetera, media policy. And that'll be at 9:30. And then we'll be getting into the domestic policy for the remainder of the several sessions looking at this. So thank you again for coming, and you guys have a great day. Bye-bye.